The world can be an incredibly strange and unpredictable place. About 5 years ago, I spent some time working as a private investigator. Let me tell you right now, it is not nearly as exciting or glamorous as it looks on television or in the movies. For the most part, you are just sitting in a car, drinking lukewarm coffee, watching a house and writing down times. It is a lot of waiting, a lot of simple surveillance, and a lot of sheer boredom. In my time as a private investigator, I did not uncover any massive government conspiracies or solve high-profile international mysteries. But there was one specific case that came across my desk that still bothers me to this day. It was a case that showed me just how deeply disturbed and manipulative some people can really be. To protect this person's privacy, I am going to call her Sue. About 6 months into my freelance career as a private investigator, I met Sue. She was a young and incredibly confident woman who ran her own business. Her company was wildly successful and was still growing rapidly when she first reached out to me. She was trying to build a high-end cocktail lounge in the heart of the city. In many ways, I really admired Sue. She was the kind of person who had started with absolutely nothing and built an entire enterprise through sheer willpower and hard work. She had spent months looking for locations, painting the walls herself, designing the menu, and dealing with the immense stress of hiring a reliable staff. When she first decided to go out on her own and start this business, she realized she needed capital. So she gathered several investors who were willing to help her fund the initial launch. One of those investors was a longtime friend of hers named Steve. At first, Sue completely refused to take any money from Steve because they were close friends. They had even gone on a few casual dates early on in their friendship, including one dinner at a high-end restaurant. But they both quickly realized that they were much better off as just friends, because Steve had a bit of a controlling personality. She had known Steve for several years at this point. They had originally met at her previous place of employment, which was a local bar. Sue was working as a bartender to pay her bills, and Steve was one of her regular customers. She did not know his exact age, but she assumed he was probably about 10 years older than she was. According to Sue and several other people who knew Steve from the bar, he was the kind of guy who constantly gave off the aura of an incredibly wealthy man. He drove a flashy red Corvette, always looked like he was dressed up in a tailored suit and ready to attend an important business meeting, and he was always the very first person to whip out his wallet to buy expensive scotch and drinks for everyone in the room. Whenever Steve would come into the bar and sit at Sue's station, she would tell him all about her big dreams and the business she wanted to start someday. Steve would offer her money almost daily, telling her he wanted to fund her dream, but Sue always politely refused. He would constantly insist on giving her the cash, but Sue never caved in. At least, she did not cave in for a while. Eventually, Sue hit a major wall with her business. During the renovation of the building, the main plumbing line collapsed, costing $20,000 she did not have. She ran out of money, and her other investors could not provide any more capital. She never wanted to take money from a friend, but it felt like Steve was her absolute last hope to make her dream a reality. So she finally accepted his investment. But she was about to find out exactly why you should never do business with your friends, especially friends you have a romantic history with, even if that history was very brief. Not long after Steve gave Sue the money, his behavior changed completely. He became incredibly mentally and emotionally abusive. Sue saved all the phone calls and text messages from that time, and eventually showed them to me. This guy called her non-stop. We are talking 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, completely blowing up her phone. He would call her at 3 in the morning, just to demand to know who she was with and what she was doing. She was terrified to change her phone number or get the law involved, because she felt a deep sense of guilt about taking his money. It got even worse for Sue as time went on. Whenever she would try to go out on a date with someone else, Steve would somehow find out, show up, and start harassing the man she was with. One night, she went out for drinks with a guy named David, whom she had been seeing for a couple of weeks. Steve actually followed them directly to the bar. When he saw David put his arm around Sue, Steve walked right up to him, punched him in the face, and knocked him completely unconscious. I have no idea how he managed to do it, but no charges were ever filed against Steve for that assault. Sue claimed it was because of his wealth and connections, but I cannot be entirely sure about that. According to Sue, this constant harassment and stalking went on for several months. She was deeply conflicted during this whole ordeal. She had already spent the majority of the money Steve had given her to build her business, so she could not just pay him back immediately. She had put everything she had into this company, but she was absolutely suffocating because of this guy. She claimed that the situation got so bad that she was convinced he was stalking her apartment at night. She lived on the second floor, and she would wake up in the dead of night and hear what sounded exactly like someone slowly climbing the fire escape and walking around right outside her bedroom window. This extreme paranoia made it virtually impossible for her to date, socialize, or grow as a person. Whether he was actually there every single night or not, that constant feeling of someone waiting around every corner was absolutely crippling for her. Everywhere she went in town, she would see what she always assumed was his distinct red pickup truck parked under a nearby street lamp. Then, one day, with absolutely zero notice, Steve completely vanished. She stopped seeing the red pickup truck altogether. He stopped showing up at her place of work. She no longer heard the terrifying sounds of footsteps outside her door at night. It was as if her life was finally returning to some level of normalcy. Sue desperately hoped that he had finally just moved on with his life and left her alone. Eventually, she felt safe enough to start dating again, and to her relief, there were no surprise appearances or attacks from Steve. For a couple of years, she lived with the quiet expectation that Steve would just show up out of nowhere one day. But as the years continued to pass, there was absolutely no sign of him. Her company finally took off and became highly profitable, and she was able to move into a beautiful new house to start the next big chapter of her life. That was when she started to think about Steve a lot. It was not because she missed him or wanted to be friends. She basically wanted to calculate all the money that Steve had put into her company and pay him back every single cent with interest, so he would never have anything to hold over her head again. She tried to get in contact with him, but the phone number she had for him was completely out of service. She tried looking him up on Facebook, Instagram, and other social media platforms, but he did not have any accounts. She even went back to the old bar where she used to work and asked the staff if anyone had seen Steve, but nobody had seen him in years. It was like he had vanished off the face of the earth. She was ready to just give up, move on, and let the whole thing go. And then something happened. In the middle of the night, she was awakened by a loud, slow knock at her front door. She crept downstairs, looked out the small window near the front door, and saw a tall figure wearing a dark hoodie, with the hood pulled tightly over his head. Her gut instantly told her that it had to be Steve, even though she had no real proof. He knocked on the door again, louder this time. She stood frozen in the dark and did not answer. She told me that he waited on her porch for about 20 minutes, just standing there in silence, before he finally turned and slowly walked away. The very next day, she contacted me, and that is when I got this entire story from her. Sue did not want to play any more games. She wanted me to find Steve so she could pay him back and officially put this nightmare behind her. I took the case and started digging. After a little bit of investigation, I made a startling discovery. His real name was not Steve. In fact, I could not even figure out where he got all the money he claimed to have. I looked up his red Corvette registration and found out it was registered to a fake shell business. I was able to find out that he had played this exact same game in several other towns under completely different names, targeting other women named Sarah and Jessica. He would show up, flaunt his supposed wealth, and try to win the affection of vulnerable women. But the most alarming part was that the last time there was any legal or digital record of him anywhere was the exact last time he had contacted Sue, which was over 2 years ago. All of his known aliases had gone completely quiet, and the apartments he used to rent were no longer inhabited by him. He had essentially dropped off the grid. One night, right in the middle of my active investigation, the hooded figure came back to Sue's front door. She was terrified and called me immediately. By the time I threw on my clothes and drove over to her house, the person was already gone. I spent a good amount of time investigating the immediate area around her house that night. I did not want to wander too far in case he was hiding in the shadows waiting for me to leave. Sue was absolutely terrified that the person at the door was indeed Steve. and that he was going to keep coming back until he got inside. I decided to spend the next few nights staked out in my car directly in front of Sue's house, drinking cold coffee and listening to the static on the radio. I told her that if he came back, I would be there to catch him. Sure enough, at around 2 o'clock in the morning, on the third night, a tall figure in a dark hoodie walked up and knocked on Sue's door. I immediately got out of my car to approach the person, but they spotted me. He took off running into the dark. He was incredibly fast, but I managed to keep track of his general direction. He ran straight into a heavily wooded area that bordered the back of Sue's property. I decided not to chase him into the pitch black woods alone, so I went back to Sue's house to make sure she was okay. I told her to pack a bag and go stay at one of her family members' houses just to be safe. Right at sunrise, I went back to the edge of the woods to track the person. After about 10 minutes of walking through the dense pine trees, I stumbled across something that was deeply terrifying and almost hard to believe. Tucked away in a small clearing was a crude, makeshift wooden shed. That is the best way I can think to describe it. I approached it cautiously, slowly opened the door, and was instantly hit by a horrible, overwhelming smell of rotting food and unwashed body. It was clear that someone had been living inside this tiny space for a very long time without bathing. Thankfully, nobody was inside the shed at that moment. There were old food wrappers, empty cans of beer, and soda bottles littered all over the dirt floor. But the absolute worst part of this disgusting shelter was not the smell or the trash. It was what I found sitting in the corner. There was a wheelchair, and sitting in that wheelchair was a full-sized mannequin. The face of the mannequin was slightly beaten up and heavily covered in cheap makeup, and it was wearing a long blonde wig that perfectly matched Sue's exact hair color. Lying in the lap of the mannequin was an old, wrinkled photograph of Steve and Sue from back when she still worked at the bar. It was highly obvious that this mannequin was meant to represent Sue in a sick, deeply twisted way. I felt a chill run down my spine. I immediately stepped outside, called the police, gave them my exact coordinates, and filled them in on everything that had been happening. I met the police officers at the edge of the woods a few minutes later and led them back to the shed. They quietly set up a perimeter and surveyed the area. Not long after they arrived, we heard footsteps. The hooded figure was walking back to the shed. He entered, completely unaware of our presence, and we could hear him talking to the mannequin as if it were a real person, saying things about how they would be together forever. The police officers stepped up and knocked loudly on the shed door. The man inside became instantly enraged. He burst out of the door and tried to violently attack one of the officers, screaming that Sue belonged to him, but they quickly subdued him and put him in handcuffs. When they pulled back the hood, we saw that it was in fact Steve. They had no idea how long he had been living like a wild animal in the woods behind Sue's house, spending his days and nights watching her every move. It is deeply tragic and terrifying that there are people out there who are capable of this level of obsession. If Sue had never reached out to me, I do not know if Steve would have eventually tried to force his way into her house. He had not tried to break in yet, but that does not change the fact that whatever his ultimate plans were, they would not have been good. What is highly frustrating is that we never got any real, concrete answers from Steve. We never found out where he went during those 2 years, or how he had lost all of his money. The man the police arrested in those woods was a completely empty shell of a human being, refusing to speak or explain himself. I am sure Sue is still recovering from the trauma of this nightmare. I do not think anyone ever fully recovers from finding out that a former friend was living in the woods, pretending a mannequin was them. It just goes to show you that even someone you consider a trusted friend can end up being a complete monster. Speaking of trust, one of my many personal faults is that I am incredibly susceptible to peer pressure. It has always been very easy for people to talk me into doing stupid things. When I was younger, I was constantly getting into serious trouble because of this weakness. For example, I actually got expelled from my very first high school for trying to steal my principal's car, simply because a group of older boys dared me to do it. Unfortunately, this complete lack of a backbone carried over directly into my adult life. A few years ago, I started to get this persistent, horrible feeling that my fiancée, Amanda, was cheating on me. She had been working a lot of late shifts at the local hospital, and instead of talking to her about it like a normal person, I decided to confide in a few of my friends. Instead of giving me mature, constructive advice, they fed into my insecurity. They told me that if I was having these feelings, there simply had to be some truth to them. I let those toxic, paranoid thoughts burrow deep into my brain. Before long, I could not sleep, I could not eat, and I could barely even function at work without being consumed by jealousy. One night, one of my friends suggested that I should hire a private investigator to track her movements, instead of just talking to her like an adult. I thought the idea was completely ridiculous at first. If I am being entirely honest, I did not even realize that private investigators were real people you could just hire. I thought they were just fictional characters added to movies to make the plot more suspenseful. Well, in my state of desperation, I did exactly what you should never do. I opened up my laptop and started searching for private investigators on Craigslist. I did not know if hiring someone to follow your fiancé was even entirely legal, so Craigslist seemed like the only place where I could find someone willing to do that kind of work. I found a listing titled "Private Eyes for Cheap, Discreet and Fast." I felt incredibly anxious about the whole thing, and I assumed the bad feeling in my stomach was just because I was doing something so incredibly sketchy. After a brief search, I contacted the only person who was located close to my area. The guy's name was Shane. We exchanged a few basic messages back and forth, and agreed to meet up in person. Shane suggested a local park that was only a few minutes away from my house. While I was driving over to the park to meet him, I felt absolutely horrible about myself. I was sweating through my shirt, knowing I was being incredibly sneaky and dishonest. But the obsessive thought of my fiancé cheating had completely hijacked my brain. I parked my car and walked around the park for a while, waiting. I texted Shane a few times to let him know I was there, but he did not answer right away. It was about 30 minutes later when he finally sent a message back, telling me exactly where to meet him. I walked over toward a massive oak tree, fully expecting to see someone dressed in a sharp suit, looking like James Bond. Instead, I saw a tall, slightly overweight man wearing a pair of old, beat-up gray sweatpants with a dark stain near the knee and a stained t-shirt. I honestly thought to myself that there was no way this guy was Shane. But then, he looked right at me and waved me over. He formally introduced himself, and then introduced me to the woman standing next to him, whose name was Gabby. He could clearly tell by the expression on my face that I was highly sketched out by their appearance. Shane immediately told me not to worry about Gabby, explaining that she was his business partner and girlfriend, and that I could trust her completely. She was chewing gum loudly and wearing a dirty track jacket, looking even more unprofessionally dressed than he was. Needless to say, their physical appearance did not do anything to make me feel better about the situation. I know there is not exactly a formal dress code for private eyes, but I expected at least some level of professionalism. Before I could even say anything, Shane acknowledged his lack of professional attire. He told me that dressing down like this was actually a crucial part of the job. He claimed that they needed to look like normal, everyday people, so they could easily blend into any crowd without drawing attention to themselves. It sounded logical enough to me at the time, so I accepted his answer and we sat down at a nearby picnic table to get down to business. Shane started asking me some standard questions, like my home address, where I worked, and where Amanda worked. But then, the questions started to get weirdly personal. He began asking very intimate questions about our relationship and daily routines, even asking what kind of underwear Amanda wore and what her childhood dog's name was. These details did not seem to have any logical relevance to tracking her. Still, because I was desperate and assumed this was just how professional investigators worked, I answered every single one of them. After a few minutes of talking, we agreed on a price. Shane told me I needed to pay half of the money right now as a deposit, and then I would pay the remaining balance once he delivered the actual proof. He insisted on cash only, claiming he wanted to keep the entire transaction completely off the books. I remember feeling extremely reluctant as I reached into my pocket and handed over the envelope of cash. I could not shake the nagging feeling that I was being scammed, but I handed the money over anyway. He took the cash, pocketed it, and told me he would be in touch very soon. A week went by, and I did not hear a single word from him. I tried calling and texting his number multiple times, but I never received a reply. I was starting to accept the fact that I had been completely scammed and that my money was gone forever. Then, one night, I received a text message at exactly 1:16 in the morning from an unknown number. The text was from Shane. He claimed that he had to get a new phone because his old one had been damaged, and he apologized for keeping me in the dark for so long. He told me that he had just uncovered some information of vital importance regarding Amanda, and that I needed to come meet him immediately. He said it absolutely could not wait until the morning. I felt an immediate surge of panic, but then I looked next to me. Amanda was fast asleep in our bed, and she had been home with me all day long. I texted Shane back and asked if we could please just meet in the morning, but he responded instantly, saying that by the morning it would be far too late. It did not make any logical sense, but my brain was so clouded by sleep deprivation and anxiety that I was not thinking clearly. Shane sent me an address and told me to hurry, and he made sure to remind me to bring the rest of the cash payment with me. Because of my job at the time, I was frequently on call 24 hours a day, so it was not unusual for me to occasionally have to leave the house in the middle of the night. I quietly got dressed, grabbed the envelope of cash, and snuck out of the house. The address Shane had given me was about a 10-minute drive away. During the entire drive, my mind was racing, imagining the absolute worst-case scenarios. I finally pulled up to the address, and my heart sank. It was a dark, run-down Victorian-style house that looked completely abandoned, with a collapsed front porch. The windows were boarded up, and there were no lights on inside or out. I was not even sure if I was in the right place. I tried texting and calling the new number Shane had reached out to me on, but there was no answer. I sat in my car for a few minutes, clutching the cash, feeling incredibly uneasy. Finally, my phone buzzed with a text message. It was from Shane, and all it said was, "Doors open." I texted him back, asking if he or Gabby could just meet me outside in the driveway since it was pitch black and I was not sure about the location. He responded almost instantly, telling me that the front door was unlocked, and that I just needed to open it and walk inside. Every single instinct in my body was screaming at me to put the car in reverse and drive away, but like an idiot, I got out of the car and walked up to the creaky porch anyway. I turned the doorknob, and just as he said, the door was completely unlocked. I pushed it open and stepped inside. It was nearly pitch black inside, and the air smelled heavily of dust and rotting wood. I called out hello a few times, but the only response was the echo of my own voice. I was terrified and decided I was going to leave, but right as I turned back toward the door, my phone buzzed again. The text from Shane read, "I hear you upstairs. Sorry. I forgot to tell you that we are down in the basement. That is where we set up our temporary office. Just walk over to the door on the far left of the room and come on down." I slowly walked across the creaky floorboards toward the far left side of the room, shining my phone's flashlight ahead of me. I found the wooden basement door and opened it. I looked down the staircase, expecting to see a light or an office, but there was absolutely nothing. It was just a dark, silent abyss. There was no light, no sound, and definitely no office down there. I stood there at the top of the stairs, and suddenly another message popped up on my screen. It said, "Are you coming down, or are you just going to stand there all night?" That text was finally the absolute last straw for me. The realization hit me like a ton of bricks. There was no investigation, and Amanda was not cheating. This was a trap to get me down into a dark basement with a large sum of cash. I quietly and quickly backed away from the basement door, slipped out the front door of the house, ran to my car, and sped away as fast as I could. I was shaking uncontrollably the entire drive home. At first, I tried to convince myself that maybe I was just being paranoid, and that I should have given them the benefit of the doubt. But then, as I was pulling into my driveway, I received one final text message from the number. All it said was, "Good for you, buddy. Take care." I ignored the message that night, completely bewildered and terrified by what it meant. I tried calling the number the next morning to demand answers, but the line was already disconnected. When I went back onto Craigslist to look for their original posting, it had been completely deleted. For the next several months, I lived in a state of constant, paralyzing fear. Shane and Gabby had my home address. They knew where I worked, and they knew my personal details. Every single little sound I heard outside my house at night made me jump, thinking it was them coming back to finish what they started in that dark basement. Eventually, the stress became too much to bear, and I broke down and told Amanda everything I had done. She was understandably upset and hurt that I had doubted her loyalty, but she sat me down and assured me that she had never cheated on me. We spent the next few months working through my severe trust issues, and we eventually saved up enough money to move into a new apartment in a completely different neighborhood. Once we were settled into our new home, I finally started to feel safe again. Looking back on it, I know I should have gone straight to the police and reported Shane and Gabby. But I was so incredibly embarrassed by my own stupidity that I just wanted to bury the whole thing. I ended up just cutting my losses and moving on with my life. It still makes me sick to my stomach to think about how incredibly close I came to walking down those dark basement stairs. I am just incredibly thankful that my survival instincts finally kicked in at the very last second. It was a very hard lesson to learn, but it will always serve as a permanent reminder to never let peer pressure dictate my actions, and to never trust sketchy strangers on the internet. But sometimes the threat does not come from a scammer on Craigslist. Sometimes the threat is someone you actually know who refuses to let you go. As many of you probably remember, the year 2020 was a highly difficult and strange time for everyone. For me, it was even more challenging because in February of that year, right before the pandemic hit, I accepted a new job offer that required me to move to a city 8 hours away from my hometown. I had barely been living in this new, unfamiliar city for a month when the entire world suddenly shut down. It was an incredibly lonely and isolating experience because I did not know a single soul in the area, and I was completely cut off from my family. After a few months of staying locked inside my apartment, I decided that I needed to make an active effort to put myself out there and connect with people. Even with all the social restrictions in place, it did not take very long for me to find myself downloading a few different dating apps. I want to be clear that I was not looking for a serious relationship or trying to find true love. Truth be told, I was just incredibly lonely and wanted to casually meet some new people, have some normal conversations, and maybe make a friend or two. Over the course of the next several months, I went on a few casual dates with a handful of different guys. None of it was serious, and while the guys were all perfectly nice, none of them were really what I was looking for. Most of them were looking for a committed relationship, which was something I just did not have the emotional capacity to give them at the time. One of the men I ended up meeting was a guy named Wade, who worked as a financial analyst. On paper, Wade was absolutely perfect. We went to a local diner on our first date, and an art gallery on our second. He was highly handsome, incredibly smart, funny, and possessed pretty much every single quality you would want in a partner. But for some reason, whenever I was around him, I felt this strange underlying sense of unease. It was just his overall vibe. Something in my gut kept telling me that something was off with him. I had forced myself into relationships in the past when my gut told me not to, and I had promised myself that I would never make that mistake again. Still, because he was so nice, I decided to give it a fair chance. We went on several more dates, and I tried my hardest to develop feelings for him, but the spark just was not there. I assumed that Wade felt the same way and realized we were not compatible. We gradually started texting each other less and less, and eventually, our connection just naturally fizzled out. I went on with my life, assuming that Wade had done the exact same thing. Neither one of us made any attempt to reach out to the other. After things ended with Wade, I decided to take a break from dating for a few weeks to focus on myself. During that time, I actually managed to make a few good friends in the area, and that deep feeling of isolation finally began to fade. But then, about 3 weeks after my last date with Wade, I started to notice a strange gray SUV, which looked like an older model Ford Explorer with heavily tinted windows, parked directly outside my apartment building. At first, I did not think much of it. It is a city, and people park on the street all the time. But after a week, it started to feel highly unusual because the SUV was parked in the exact same spot every single night, and I never saw anyone get in or out of it. I started paying close attention to my neighbors' vehicles, but as far as I could tell, nobody on my street had recently purchased a new gray SUV. That weekend, I drove over to the local grocery store to pick up some food. While I was walking down the aisles, I was suddenly hit with this horrible, intense feeling that someone was watching me and following me. The store was packed with shoppers, so it was almost impossible to tell if my paranoia was real. or if I was just overreacting. I quickly paid for my groceries and walked out to the parking lot. When I got to my car, my heart stopped. Parked directly next to my Honda was the exact same gray Ford Explorer with the dark tinted windows. I tried to tell myself it was just a coincidence, but I was deeply freaked out. I quickly threw my grocery bags into the trunk, got into the driver's seat, and locked the doors. As I was driving out of the parking lot, I happened to look toward the entrance of the store. Standing there was a tall man with slicked back hair, wearing dark aviator sunglasses, and he was staring directly at my car as I drove past. I felt a cold sweat break out, but I tried to force myself to calm down. I had a coffee date scheduled for that afternoon with a guy named Paul, and I did not want to ruin it. Paul was a graphic designer, and this was my very first date since things had fizzled out with Wade. I met Paul at a cozy coffee shop in the late afternoon. The date was going absolutely wonderfully. Paul was incredibly charming, easy to talk to, and for the first time in a very long time, I felt a genuine spark. But while we were laughing and talking, I happened to look out the window of the coffee shop, and my stomach instantly dropped. Parked across the street was the gray SUV. Paul could immediately tell that something was wrong, because my entire demeanor changed in an instant. I became quiet and visibly anxious. I started scanning the coffee shop, trying to see if the tall man with the slicked back hair was inside, and then I saw him. He was sitting at a small corner table near the exit, holding a book but staring directly over the top of it, casually watching me. This was no longer a series of coincidences. This man was actively stalking me. I did not want to freak Paul out, or make myself look crazy on our very first date by telling him that a creepy guy in a gray SUV was following me around town. I figured that was a pretty good way to ensure I never got a second date. So, I lied. I told Paul that I had a sudden work emergency that I needed to go handle immediately. He was incredibly understanding about it. We said our goodbyes, and I left the coffee shop in a hurry. I purposefully took a long, winding route home, turning down random side streets to see if I could shake him. It did not work. Within a few minutes, I looked in my rearview mirror and saw the gray SUV tailing me closely. I drove around aimlessly for another 20 minutes until I finally managed to lose him in traffic. And then I rushed home and locked myself inside. That night, I decided to text Paul and explain the real, embarrassing reason why I had run off so suddenly. To my relief, he was incredibly understanding and supportive. While I was texting him, I decided to peek through my living room blinds. Sure enough, the gray SUV was parked directly outside my house once again. I started to panic. Paul stayed on the phone with me and calmly convinced me that I needed to call the police and report what was happening. I dialed non-emergency, and a few minutes later, a patrol car pulled up. I watched from my window as the two officers got out and approached the gray SUV. The tall man with the slicked back hair opened his door and stepped out. I expected him to look nervous or angry, but he looked completely calm and relaxed. He spoke to the officers for a few minutes, and then he reached into his jacket pocket and showed them his official private investigator license and his active contract paperwork. After a brief conversation, the officers walked away from the SUV and came up to my front door. The officer informed me that they could not arrest the man because he was indeed a licensed private investigator and he was legally allowed to park on the public street and follow me. I desperately pressed the officers for more information, wanting to know who had hired him, but they told me they were not legally allowed to disclose that information. I was completely shocked and absolutely terrified. I could not comprehend who would go to the trouble of hiring a professional investigator to follow me. I barely knew anyone in this city. It felt like a massive, terrifying violation of my privacy. After the police left, the gray SUV finally drove away, and it did not return over the next few days. I did my best to move on with my life, but that constant paranoid feeling of being watched never truly went away. A few weeks later, Paul and I decided to go for a hike at one of the beautiful state parks located just outside the city. It was a gorgeous, sunny day, but the moment we stepped onto the trail, that familiar, creeping feeling of being followed returned. It was not just me, either. Even Paul kept stopping, turning around, and staring into the thick woods behind us, asking if I had heard twigs snapping. I tried to shake off the fear, jokingly telling Paul that it was probably just another private investigator trying to get the job done. We both laughed, but the tension was thick. When we finally finished the hike and got back to the parking lot, Paul said he needed to use the restroom before we drove back. I stood outside the restroom building, looking down at my phone, when I suddenly heard the rapid sound of heavy footsteps running toward me. I looked up, and sprinting out of the tree line was Wade. Before I could even react, he grabbed my arm with an incredibly tight grip and began shouting directly in my face, telling me that we were leaving together right now. I was completely frozen in terror and started screaming at the top of my lungs. Wade kept yelling over my screams, claiming that I had been unfaithful to him, but that he was willing to forgive me as long as I got in his car and came home with him. Hearing my screams, Paul burst out of the restroom and immediately tackled Wade to the ground. The two men struggled for a moment, but Wade quickly scrambled back to his feet and began screaming violent threats at both of us. Paul did not back down. He stood his ground, putting himself between me and Wade. Seeing that Paul was not intimidated, Wade started to slowly back away into the woods. We ran to Paul's car, locked the doors, and I immediately called the police to report the attempted kidnapping. Initially, the police could not do much because there was no physical evidence of an attempted abduction, and it was essentially our word against his. But believe it or not, the private investigator that Wade had hired is the one who ended up saving me in the end. It turns out that while the investigator was actively tracking my movements, he quickly realized that I was not actually in a relationship with Wade, and that Wade had lied to him, telling him that I was his runaway wife who had stolen his life savings and disappeared in the middle of the night. The investigator began to realize that Wade was highly unstable and obsessive, and he had actually warned Wade to stay away from me. When the police contacted the investigator, he cooperated fully, giving them a detailed statement about Wade's erratic and dangerous behavior. Thanks to the investigator's testimony, I was able to successfully secure a restraining order against Wade. Not long after the legal proceedings, Wade completely vanished. He deleted all of his social media accounts, disconnected his phone, and seemingly moved away. I still live with the constant, lingering fear that he might show up in my life again someday. What scares me the most is the fact that I barely knew this man, yet he was willing to go to such extreme lengths to stalk and try to abduct me. If Paul had not been there with me that afternoon, I have no idea what Wade would have done to me. It might sound like an exaggeration to some, but I truly believe that Paul saved my life that day. The experience changed the way I trust people forever. It has been a few years now since that terrifying afternoon, and I still look over my shoulder every time I walk to my car, praying to God that I never see his face again. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. Until next time, see ya. When most of us think about schools, we picture crowded hallways, loud teenagers, and the constant hum of daytime activity. We see teachers writing on whiteboards, friends talking by their lockers, and coaches shouting instructions on the gym floor. It is a place of learning and energy. But there is a completely different version of these buildings that very few people ever get to see. It is the school that exists after 10 o'clock at night. When the last teacher turns off their desk lamp, locks their classroom door, and drives home, a heavy silence settles over the empty corridors. For the night custodians, this is when their workday actually begins. It is a lonely and often unsettling job. You walk down corridors that are usually filled with the loud chatter of hundreds of young students. But now, the only thing you can hear is the hum of your own thoughts. You are completely alone in a massive structure that was built to hold thousands of people. Every single step you take echoes down the hallways. Every creak of the floorboards sounds like a threat. Most night custodians will tell you that you eventually get used to the quiet. You learn to tune out the strange noises and focus on your work. But sometimes the noises are not just the building settling. Sometimes something is down there with you. Our first story begins with a man who worked as an overnight custodian at an old middle school. He spent almost 5 years working the late shift. His schedule was always the same. He would arrive at the school, clock in around 10 o'clock at night, and work until just before the sun came up. In the beginning, he actually enjoyed the work. He was a quiet guy who liked to be left alone, and this job was perfect for that. He did not have to deal with noisy kids running through the hallways. He could just put his headphones in, push his cleaning cart, and do his job in peace. But as the months turned into years, he started to notice how different the school felt at night compared to during the day. It wasn't just quiet, it felt dead. The building itself was quite old, having been built back in the 1950s. The walls would groan, the heating pipes would knock, and the roof would creak whenever the wind blew outside. When you are the only person in a 3-story building, your brain starts to play tricks on you. A locker door upstairs would suddenly pop open with a loud click, or a draft would blow a piece of paper across the floor. For the most part, he learned to ignore these little things. But there was one specific area of the school that he could never get used to, and that was the basement. The basement of this middle school was not a nice finished area. Because the school was built in the 1950s, the basement was basically a massive concrete maze that ran under about half of the entire campus. It was dark, damp, and smelled constantly of wet cement and old, musty paper. The ceilings were low, with thick rusted pipes and tangled black wires hanging down just above your head. The basement was divided into several different storage rooms. Some of these rooms were filled with towering piles of wooden desks. Others were packed with heavy cardboard boxes containing outdated textbooks that had not been opened in 30 years. The lighting down there was terrible. The old fluorescent bulbs would buzz loudly and flicker constantly, and half of them did not even work at all. If you had to go down there, you always had to bring a powerful flashlight. On his very first week on the job, one of the older custodians had pulled him aside. The older man had a serious look on his face when he told him to avoid the basement unless it was absolutely necessary. He joked that the basement was haunted, but our custodian noticed that the older man never laughed with his eyes. He realized that the veterans on the staff genuinely avoided that basement. Even just walking past the heavy wooden door that led downstairs gave our custodian a cold, uneasy feeling, so he avoided it whenever possible. For the first 2 years of his employment, he managed to keep that promise. But one night, his luck finally ran out. He was looking at the daily task list his supervisor had taped to his cart. At the bottom of the list was a note. It instructed him to go down to the basement and bring up several stacks of metal folding chairs for an event the following morning. As soon as he read the note, his stomach dropped. He stood at the top of the basement stairs for a long time, holding the heavy brass handle of the door, debating if he could ask his supervisor if it could wait until morning. But he did not want to look lazy, so he grabbed his flashlight, unlocked the door, and stepped onto the concrete stairs. The door clicked shut behind him, cutting off the warm light from the main hallway. The stairwell echoed with every step he took, like his boots were way too loud. When he reached the bottom of the stairs, he reached out and flipped the main light switch. A few of the fluorescent lights down the long hallway buzzed to life, leaving most of the hallway in darkness. The smell of wet cement was overwhelming. He turned on his flashlight and started walking. The chairs were supposed to be in the second storage room on the left. The first room was full of old desks, piled all the way to the ceiling. The second door was half rusted, and it squealed like nails on a chalkboard when he pulled it open. Inside, the room smelled of dust and wood polish. The folding chairs were stacked against the wall in uneven piles. He bent down and started pulling them out, trying to carry as many as he could at once, so he would not have to make so many trips. He had just picked up 4 when he froze. From somewhere out in the hallway, he heard a soft dragging sound, like someone was slowly sliding their shoe across the concrete floor. He held his breath, still bent over with the chairs in his arms. Listening as hard as he could, the sound stopped. He slowly stood up and peeked his head out into the hallway, shining the flashlight both ways. The beam cut through the dark, but there was nothing there. His heart was thumping in his ears. He stood there for what felt like forever before finally telling himself it was probably just the pipes, or maybe he had shifted a chair without realizing it. He carried the first load out into the hallway and toward the stairs. As he walked, he suddenly felt a cold draft against his face. It was so out of place that it made him stop mid-step. The basement was always warm and stale with no windows. This felt like standing next to an open freezer. He shined his light up and down the hallway, but nothing looked different. He shook it off, set the chairs at the bottom of the stairs, and went back for more. When he walked into the storage room again, something felt off. The stack of chairs looked different, like they had shifted while he was gone. He frowned at them, trying to remember exactly how they had been leaning. He finally told himself he was just being paranoid, and picked up another load. This time, as he turned to leave, he heard it again, a thump followed by a scraping sound. It came from farther down the basement hallway. His flashlight beam shook in his hand as he aimed it that way. About 20 feet down, one of the classroom doors that should have been closed tight was cracked open. His stomach dropped. He knew he had not touched that door. The school was locked up every night, and no one was supposed to be there except him. He stood frozen in the doorway of the storage room, staring at that cracked door. Every part of him screamed to drop the chairs and run upstairs, but he just stood there. He told himself that maybe the door had come loose, or maybe when he opened another door, the air pressure had shifted. He clung to those excuses like a lifeline. He carried the chairs quickly to the stairwell, then came back with his flashlight in one hand, empty-handed this time. The cracked door was still there, open just enough for someone to peek out. His throat went dry. He crept toward it slowly, each step echoing. When he was close, he called out, "Hello, anyone down here?" His voice cracked and it sounded small in the big empty basement. No answer. He swallowed hard, then pushed the door open fast with his free hand and shined the flashlight inside. The room was completely and utterly empty, just shells of dusty science equipment, boxes stacked high, cobwebs in the corners. He stepped inside for a second, heart racing, listening for any sound. That is when he heard it again, a dragging shuffle, but this time it was behind him in the hallway. He spun around and pointed the flashlight with the beam cutting down the corridor. Nothing, just shadows and concrete, but he felt it. That heavy pressure you get when you know you are being watched. His skin prickled all over. He did not care about the chairs anymore. He backed up slowly, keeping the flashlight aimed down the hallway, and made his way toward the stairwell. When he got to the stairs, he grabbed the chairs he had left and carried them up 2 steps at a time. He did not stop until he was back in the main hallway upstairs, gasping for breath. He leaned against the wall, sweating even though the school was cold. He told himself he was imagining things. Maybe it had been rats or water pipes, but he could not explain the cracked door. He locked the stairwell door behind me, even though he was not supposed to, and he did not go back down for the rest of the night. A week later, he was mopping the hallway right above the basement stairs when he heard it again. 3 loud bangs, evenly spaced, like someone hitting the wall with their fist. The mop slipped out of his hand, water dripping onto the tiles. He froze and listened. Then he heard the basement door rattle like someone had shoved it from the other side. His blood went cold. He did not open it. He stood there gripping the mop handle until the sound stopped. After that, he refused to go down into the basement alone. If anything needed to come up, he would wait until another custodian was there. He never told the others what he heard, because he knew they would either laugh or tell me it was the so-called ghost. But he knows what he felt, and he knows what he heard. To this day, when he thinks about those slow dragging footsteps behind me, he feels sick to his stomach. It is a memory that has stayed with him for years, and it is the main reason why he eventually decided to leave that school district altogether. Our second story takes us to a high school, where a custodian worked for 3 years. He was the newest guy on the team, so most of the time he got stuck with the overnight shifts. The building was huge, with 4 floors and 2 gymnasiums, and at night when it was empty, it felt like a giant maze. The rule was to go floor by floor, room by room, turning off lights, emptying trash, and locking doors. It usually took the whole night to cover everything, and if you tried to rush, you would miss something. One Friday night, he was working alone because one of the other custodians had called out sick. Normally, they worked in pairs, so he was not used to being the only one on duty. At first, the shift was normal. He started on the first floor, emptying trash cans, wiping down surfaces, and mopping the hallways. The lights in some of the old corridors flickered, which made the shadows jump around, but he told himself it was just the building settling. Around midnight, he made his way up to the 3rd floor. That floor always gave him a bad feeling because it was quieter than the others. It had a lot of older classrooms that were not used anymore, some permanently locked, and others were just storage rooms filled with dusty books, broken furniture, and old lab equipment. As he walked down the hallway, he passed the lockers. The metallic click of the doors and the echo of his boots against the tiles made him jump a few times. He kept reminding himself it was normal. He was halfway through mopping one of the main hallways when he noticed a door about 20 feet away was open. That struck him immediately because he had already checked all the rooms earlier in the evening and every door had been locked. His first instinct was to walk past it quickly and ignore it. But something made him stop. He set his mop against the wall and walked over slowly, trying to make as little noise as possible. The door was one of those old wooden classroom doors with a square glass window. He pushed it open slowly, shining his flashlight inside. The room looked empty. The desks were stacked along the walls, and boxes were in the corners. Nothing seemed out of place at first glance, but then he noticed that one of the boxes near the back wall had been moved. It was tilted, not lined up with the others, and there were scuff marks on the floor, like it had been dragged across the tiles. His stomach sank. He knew he had closed that door earlier, and he knew he had not moved that box. He told himself it was probably nothing, just his imagination playing tricks on him because he was tired. He pulled the door closed and went back to mopping, but his mind kept wandering to that room. He kept thinking he should check the windows. Maybe a student had snuck in somehow, but all the windows were locked from the inside. He tried to shake the feeling of being watched and focused on the cleaning. After finishing that hallway, he went down to the stairwell to head to the second floor. As he walked past that same classroom again, his heart nearly stopped. The door was wide open. His breath caught in his throat. He knew he had shut it before. He slowly stepped closer. He peeked inside and the room looked normal, except the box was now moved to the center of the floor. His pulse was racing. He whispered, "Hello, who is in here?" His voice sounded tiny in the emptiness of the building. He waited, but there was silence. And then from the back of the room he heard slow, deep breathing. Not a gust of wind or a pipe. It was someone trying to be quiet, but making sure he could hear it. He tried to convince himself it was a student hiding, playing a prank. But how would they have gotten in? He was the only one who was supposed to be there, and all the doors were locked. He slammed the door shut and ran down the hallway to the stairwell. His heart was hammering and sweat ran down his back. He stayed pressed against the stairwell door, listening. He debated calling his supervisor, even though he hated bothering him in the middle of the night. Finally, he did. When his supervisor picked up, our custodian told him what was happening, trying to keep his voice steady. The supervisor said he would be there in 20 minutes. Those 20 minutes felt like hours. He stayed as far away from that room as possible, peeking over his shoulder every few seconds. Finally, his supervisor arrived. They went back up together. The supervisor had a big flashlight and walked straight into the classroom. The box was still in the middle of the floor. They checked everywhere. The closets, under the tables, behind the desks, there was nothing. He suggested the custodian was just tired or imagining things. The custodian did not argue, but he knew what he had heard. That slow, heavy breathing. He tried to finish the rest of his shift with his supervisor there, but he kept glazing at that classroom. The hallway felt colder and more oppressive than ever. Even sweeping and mopping did not distract him. Weeks later, when he worked with another custodian, he was told that years ago, a student had been caught hiding in that classroom overnight. They had snuck in to play a prank, but it scared the staff so much that they never used that room again. It made sense, but it did not explain the breathing he heard that night. There was no one else in the school. He finished the shift and left, but every time he thought about it, his stomach twisted. He started taking extra precautions, ensuring all doors were locked, and eventually he transferred out of the school. Our third story comes from a night custodian who worked at an old high school for 2 years. The worst part of the job was always the auditorium. It was massive with 3 levels of seating, a big stage, and long, heavy curtains that hung from the ceiling. During the day, it looked normal. But at night, when the building was empty, it felt like stepping into a completely different place. Even with the lights on, there were shadows in every corner that seemed darker than they should be. Sound carried strangely in there. If you dropped a broom, the echo would stretch and bounce, making it hard to tell exactly where the sound came from. Most nights, he saved the auditorium for last because he hated going in there. There was just something about it that always made his skin crawl. Near the end of winter one year, he had to clean it earlier than usual because there was going to be a play the next morning. He arrived around midnight, dragging his cart behind him. The side door creaked loudly as he opened it, and when it slammed shut behind him, the echo traveled across the empty room. He started by sweeping the aisles between the seats. The chairs were old metal, folding seats bolted to the floor in some rows, and in other rows they were loose. As he pushed the broom, he listened to the scraping sound echo off the walls and ceiling. After a few minutes, he thought he heard something else. It was faint at first, like a soft rustling from the stage. He froze, thinking maybe a prop had fallen over, but when he looked, the stage was empty. He shook his head and told himself it was nothing. He continued sweeping. A few minutes later, he heard it again. This time it was more distinct, the sound of slow footsteps across the stage. He stopped sweeping and looked toward the stage. He could see the stacked props in the corners. Nothing moved, but the sound was real. His breathing became shallow. He slowly climbed the steps onto the stage, shining the flashlight behind the curtains. There were ropes, pulleys, old chairs, and painted scenery stacked against the walls. Everything was covered in dust, and the beam of his light made it dance like it was moving. He could not shake the feeling that someone or something was nearby. He backed off the stage, telling himself it was just the building settling, maybe a mouse in the rafters, but the feeling did not go away. He continued sweeping down the aisles, trying to finish as fast as possible. His mind kept going back to the stage. The sound of those slow footsteps repeated in his head, even though he could not hear them anymore. He finished sweeping the lower level and started mopping. As he pushed the mop through the rows, he thought he saw a shadow move across the second tier of seats. He moved his flashlight toward the seats, but nothing was there. The whispering came again, much clearer this time. It sounded exactly like someone speaking his name almost directly behind him. He spun around so fast that the flashlight slipped in his hands. The stage was completely empty. Nothing. The props were still stacked in the same place, and the curtains did not move, but he knew he had not imagined the voice. He backed away slowly with his heart racing, and he moved toward the side door. He stopped at the edge of the stage and listened. He could hear soft footsteps on the upper levels moving slowly across the balcony. He told himself it was impossible. The auditorium was locked. No one else should have been there. The footsteps continued, stopping and starting as if someone were pacing and watching him. He finally ran to the door, grabbed the handle, and pulled it open. The cold night air hit me like a wall, and he felt relief, but he could still hear the faint echo of footsteps above, fading away slowly. His hands were shaking so badly that he could barely lock the heavy door behind him. He leaned against the cold metal, catching his breath and feeling the sweat running down his forehead. He did not go back inside that night. Weeks later, he learned that years ago, a drama teacher had died suddenly in that auditorium during a rehearsal. He had a sudden heart attack right on stage in front of his students. People said sometimes you could still hear him walking the stage at night, or hear whispers in the seats. He tried to convince himself it was just a story, but he knew what he felt. He quit that job not long after, and he never looked back. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. Until next time, see ya. Imagine driving home after a long, exhausting graveyard shift. The roads are completely empty, the night is pitch black, and all you want to do is get into your warm bed. That was the situation for a young man driving his pickup truck down a quiet parkway late one night. Suddenly, he got an incredibly intense and painful urge to use the restroom. Since the parkway was completely deserted, he decided to pull over to the side of the road, right next to a thick patch of woods. He turned on his hazard lights just in case a police car happened to drive by, walked into the trees, and took care of business. But when he got back into his truck and turned the key, instead of the engine roaring to life, he heard a weak, clicking sound. His battery was completely dead. He tried starting the truck 5 more times, but it was no use. He decided to leave his hazards blinking and stepped out of his truck, hoping he could flag down a passing driver who might have jumper cables. After a few minutes, he saw a pair of headlights approaching. He stepped to the edge of the road and began waving his arms. The car slowed down and pulled over directly behind his truck. He walked toward the car, but as he did, both front doors opened, and 2 very large, imposing men stepped out. He stopped in his tracks. There was something about the way these men carried themselves that immediately made him feel uneasy, giving off a distinct gangster vibe. Trying to remain polite, he thanked them for stopping and asked if they had jumper cables. The two men looked at each other before the driver slowly said they did not. The passenger then asked if he was stuck, and he explained his battery had died. The driver told him to give him a second and said he would call one of his boys to come help. He did not like the sound of that at all. The driver got back into his car to make the call, and he quickly got back into his own truck. Sitting in his cab, the sense of danger grew. He pulled out his phone and called his older brother. It was past midnight, so his brother did not answer at first, but after a few tries, his brother finally answered. He quickly explained that he was stuck in an emergency on the parkway and desperately needed him to bring jumper cables. Hearing the panic in his voice, his brother said he would be there in a few minutes. He hung up and stepped back out of his truck to tell the men he had help on the way. He waved his arms and called out that he was good. The driver opened his door, looked at him, and simply said that he was done. Then, the driver got back inside. He thought the men were going to leave, so he leaned his seat back to relax. But as he sat there, he realized the woods were silent. He had not heard their engine start, and they had not driven away. They were still parked right behind him after 5 minutes. Terrified, he called his brother again, telling him to floor it and bring some weapons because he was about to be jumped. His brother said he had his baseball bat ready. Just then, another set of headlights appeared, pulling up behind the first car. He got out of his truck, hoping it was his brother, but as the doors of the new car opened, he realized it was not. The driver of the first car got out and greeted the new arrivals. Several men were now standing in the road, with no jumper cables in sight, slowly walking toward his truck. Suddenly, the familiar headlights of his brother's Mustang came zooming down the parkway, pulling up right in front of his truck. His brother jumped out holding a wooden baseball bat and tossed a second bat to him. His brother stood his ground, shouting that they did not want trouble and that the men needed to move along. The group of men backed up slightly, but as he looked closely at the first car, he realized the original passenger was gone. He whispered to his brother to watch out because one of the men was missing. His brother popped his hood and quickly connected the jumper cables to the truck battery. All the while, they kept watch. Suddenly, his brother softly called his name and tilted his head toward the woods. He looked over and saw the missing passenger hiding in the thick brush, crouching down for a surprise attack. His brother told him to try the ignition. He turned the key, and the engine finally started. He jumped back out to stand guard while his brother unplugged the cables. They quickly whispered their escape plan to each other. The moment they got into their respective vehicles, his brother would throw his Mustang into reverse to clear the lane, and he would slam his foot on the gas to pull out onto the road. They shut their hoods, ran to their vehicles, and immediately stepped on the gas. His brother floored it in reverse, and as soon as there was enough space, he slammed his foot down on the gas pedal. But just as he pulled out, a massive crash shattered his back window. A heavy brick had been thrown through, landing on his dash. Immediately after, gunshots filled the air, shattering the remaining glass. He ducked down low and managed to speed away unharmed. They drove straight home and woke up their 65-year-old father, who was absolutely certain they had run into a local gang. He warned them never to take that specific parkway at night again. He could only guess the men had intended to rob him blind, and they had not taken kindly to having baseball bats waved in their faces. Our second story takes us deep into the wilderness, where a seasoned camper named David found himself in a situation that no amount of outdoor experience could prepare him for. David had spent most of his life camping, often preferring to go entirely on his own. He loved the peace of the deep woods, and he knew all the safety protocols for dealing with wildlife and weather. But on one particular solo trip, he learned that the most dangerous predators in the forest do not always walk on 4 legs. David had set up his campsite next to a small, gently flowing river. It was late at night, and his campfire was down to its final glowing embers. David was zipped up inside his sleeping bag, listening to the soothing sound of the rushing water as he drifted off to sleep. But just as he was about to lose consciousness, he heard a sound that made his eyes snap open. It was the distinct sound of a dry branch snapping in the distance. He lay perfectly still, listening intently. A few moments later, he heard another snap, followed by the rustling of dry leaves on the forest floor. Something was moving out there, and it seemed to be circling his tent. At first, David tried to rationalize the sounds. He wondered if it could be a bear or a large deer, but the footsteps did not feel heavy enough to belong to a bear. Furthermore, wild animals are typically deterred by a campfire, yet these footsteps were getting closer, continuously circling the thin walls of his tent. David decided to remain completely silent, hoping that whatever it was would lose interest and wander away. But the footsteps did not stop. They kept pacing around the perimeter of his camp, moving slow and deliberate, unable to take the suspense. David sat up. He decided to let whatever was out there know that the tent was occupied. He took a deep breath and called out a loud hello. The moment the word left his mouth, the footsteps stopped. The silence that followed was heavy and suffocating. David waited, but there was no response. He decided he needed to see what he was dealing with. He carefully unzipped the door of his tent and crawled out. The campfire was almost completely out, casting only a faint glow. As he stood up, he heard the footsteps start again, but this time they were much softer and more cautious. David stared into the pitch-black woods, trying to focus eyes. He looked in the direction of the soft rustling sounds. Then he saw it. For just a fraction of a second, a bright light illuminated a small patch of the dark woods. It was undeniably the bright blue glow of a smartphone screen. The light turned on, casting a faint glow on the surrounding trees, and then was instantly switched off. David felt his blood run cold. There was a human being standing in the dark woods, just yards away from his tent, watching him in silence. He had called out to them, and they had refused to answer. David knew that his safety was seriously compromised. Fortunately, he had a license to carry a concealed firearm, and he always brought his handgun with him on camping trips. He reached into his pack, pulled out his gun, and began packing up his gear as fast as his hands could move. The fear he felt was overwhelming. Every few seconds, he found himself spinning around, aiming his flashlight into the trees to make sure no one was sneaking up behind him. The soft footsteps in the woods continued to hover just beyond the reach of his flashlight's beam. Once he had stuffed his sleeping bag and his tent into their respective bags, David did not even try to hide the fact that he was sprinting as fast as his legs could carry him toward his car, which was parked in a small, isolated dirt lot not far away. He threw his gear into the back seat, scrambled into the driver's seat, and immediately locked all the doors first thing. He let out a long breath, turned the key, and the engine started up. He shifted the car into drive and pressed the gas pedal to flee. But the moment the car began to move, the vehicle began to wobble and shake violently, accompanied by a terrible grinding noise. David immediately stopped. The low tire pressure alert came on for all 4 tires. He knew then that all 4 tires had been slashed by someone. He could not possibly move his car without destroying the wheels. So he sat there in the pitch-black forest, with the only light coming from his headlights. He was afraid to look outside in any direction. He sat there with his whole body shaking, grabbing his phone to call the police. But as he lifted the phone, he looked in the rearview mirror and saw someone standing at the trunk of his car. His heart was in his stomach. He grabbed the handgun, opened the door, and stepped out with aggression. He aimed the gun at the person standing at the back of his car who raised his hands in the air. He screamed at him to get away from his car. The man backed away into the woods. David got back inside, called the police, and waited. A state trooper and a tow truck arrived 20 minutes later, and David finally felt safe. Our third and final story involves a young man named Alex, who drove an old Buick with a faulty gas gauge. The gauge was notoriously off. Sometimes, Alex would fill the tank completely, and the needle would still hover around empty. Other times, the tank was running low, but the needle would sit around full. The needle seemed to decide when it wanted to work, so Alex had to estimate how much fuel he actually had left, based on how long it had been since his last fill up. One night, after coming back from a vacation and not driving for a week, Alex had forgotten how long it had been since he had filled up the tank. While driving down a quiet road in an even quieter town, the car suddenly ran out of gas. He rolled to a stop, realizing he was completely stuck. He did not want to call his girlfriend because she lived too far away, and he did not want to be a bother so late at night. He got out of his car and looked around. There was nothing but trees on either side of the road, except for a small house sitting atop a hill to his right. Since there were lights on in the house, Alex decided to walk up the hill to ask for help. It was about 9:30, so it was not too late to ring someone's bell. He went up to the house and rang the doorbell. He waited patiently, seeing the lights on inside, but after a minute, no one answered. He gave the bell one more ring, waited another minute, and then accepted defeat. As he walked down the walkway, he heard a weird noise coming from the side of the house. It sounded like the moaning and distressed breathing of someone in pain, coming from behind a line of bushes. It did not feel right to snoop around in the dark, so he continued back down the driveway. However, he took a look back at the house and noticed an upstairs light was now on. He could see the silhouette of someone standing at the window, staring down at him. He expected them to come to the door, but they just stood there, which felt very weird. Alex went back to his car, leaned on the door, and called his roadside assistance company. They said they would deliver gas to him within half an hour. It was too hot to sit in his car, so he stayed outside, texting friends and pacing back and forth. Suddenly, a deep voice said, "Excuse me." Alex looked up to see a guy standing by the curb near the driveway to the house. The man was wearing a hat pulled low, hiding most of his face. He asked Alex if there was a problem, and Alex explained that he had run out of gas. The man simply said, "Oh," turned around, and walked back up the hill, disappearing behind the bushes. The interaction felt incredibly creepy. Alex texted his girlfriend about the whole thing, and she joked that he should go see what that sound behind the bushes was. Alex realized he actually wanted to check, just in case someone was in serious danger. He snuck through the trees next to the house, making his way up the hill to the side where he had heard the noises. He tiptoed up to the wall and stopped to listen. Sure enough, he heard the moaning and heavy breathing again. The sounds were coming from a window. He went to the window and tried to look inside, but the blind was down. Deeply concerned, Alex lightly tapped on the window and asked if everything was okay. To his shock, he heard a faint, weak voice from inside say, "Help." Suddenly, the blind kinked open with a sharp snap, and a pale face looked back at him through the window. It was incredibly dark, but Alex could see enough to realize the face looked exactly like the creepy man who had just spoken to him outside. The kink in the blind dropped back down, shutting out the view, and then the window dropped closed so he could not hear anything else. Terrified, Alex ran back down to his car, got inside, and locked the doors. When the roadside assistance truck arrived and filled his tank, Alex was too shaken to say a word about what he had just witnessed. He simply paid the driver, went home, and tried to sleep, desperate to forget the unsettling mystery of that house on the hill. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. Until next time, see ya. A lot of horror movies are legitimately scary, but in some cases, the events that took place on the sets of certain horror movies were more terrifying than the movies themselves. A number of horrifying incidents have taken place on the sets of some of the most successful horror movies of all time, before, during, or shortly after filming. Whether or not these incidents were fatal accidents, cruel twists of fate, or some sort of evil curse still remains debatable. Perhaps a good place to start would be the Amityville Horror House, whose events may start to seem even scarier when you learn that horrors also took place on the sets for both the 1979 movie and the 2005 remake. The first Amityville movie starred James Brolin, who was not originally eager to take on the role, but eventually he accepted it because of something strange that happened while reading the script. One morning, as he got to a scary section of the story, a pair of the actor's pants suddenly fell off a hanger in his closet, causing him to literally jump out of his chair in fright. James, of course, saw this as a sign that he needed to take the role, and the rest was history. Fast forward to the 2005 remake, with Ryan Reynolds taking on the part that was originally played by James Brolin. During filming, Ryan Reynolds, along with other cast members, claimed that every morning at exactly 3:15 they would wake up. The reason why that is terrifying is because 3:15 in the morning was the exact time that Ronald DeFeo murdered his entire family in the house, and it becomes a whole lot more creepy. At one point during filming, there was also an actual dead body that washed up near the filming, set in the boathouse in the backyard of the house. Actors and crew members always suspected that there was an otherworldly presence during the filming of the movie. Whether they were right or just overly paranoid, nobody knows. The 2012 film The Possession is an unconventional horror movie that involves rabbis, Judaism, and a cursed Jewish relic called a dybbuk box that attaches itself to a young girl. A dybbuk box is a wine cabinet claimed to be haunted by a dybbuk, which is a malevolent wandering spirit that enters and possesses the body of a living person until exorcised. What happened on the set of The Possession left even the star of the movie, Jeffrey Dean Morgan, feeling very uneasy, and he already had a lot of experience acting in horror movies and shows under his belt. Some of the seemingly supernatural things that happened included lights exploding for no apparent reason, as well as chilly breezes wafting through closed sets for no particular reason. But the scariest incident occurred when the storage facility where all the movie props were being held caught fire and burned to the ground. A team of investigators concluded that the fire was not started from an electrical fault or arson, but the actual cause for the fire could not be determined. The dybbuk box used in the movie, which played an important role in the story, was completely destroyed in the fire. The cast and crew later refused to allow the movie's producers to replace the dybbuk box, for fear that it was truly cursed. The Conjuring is a movie that is supposed to be based on the true story of the Perron family, who claim to be tormented by supernatural entities in their Rhode Island home in the 70s. While several of the family members spent time on the set during filming, the mother refused to go anywhere near it, as she was convinced that several unexplained events that plagued the filming of this movie on set were proof that the spirits had not finished with them yet. For instance, when members of the Perron family were visiting, a furious gust of wind suddenly rose and seemed to swirl around them. However, nobody could see any movement in any of the trees just opposite them, movement you would expect to see from any normal gust of wind. Just a couple of days later, the hotel that the actors and movie crew were staying in caught fire, and everyone had to be evacuated. And it does not end there. James Wan, the movie's director, recalls working late in his office one evening when his dog started growling at something. He would get up to investigate, but he could not find anything that would be antagonizing the dog. However, the dog had his sights on something across the room, and it seemed he had focused on an unseen entity in one corner of the room. James took a break from working after this. Having been legitimately freaked out, Vera Farmiga, who played the role of a paranormal investigator in the film, refused to take the script home with her, as she said it made her feel uneasy. She also could not read it at night because she became paralyzed by fear whenever she tried. After a phone call discussion with James Wan, Vera opened her laptop screen, and there were 3 digital claw marks running from the upper right diagonal to the lower left. This was not the last time it happened, though. Her next experience came a few months later, literally on the day that she completed work on the movie. She returned home to upstate New York, and when she woke up the next day, she discovered what she describes as 3 claw mark bruises across her thigh. In 1983, a movie based on the Twilight Zone series was released. During filming, actor Vic Morrow was killed on the set. Deaths on movie sets have happened many times, but what makes this extra disturbing is the fact that Morrow appeared to predict his demise just a year earlier. A year before filming of the Twilight Zone movie began, Vic took out a $5 million life insurance policy on himself, explaining to friends and family members that he had a premonition. Something bad was going to happen to him on an upcoming movie. He had seen it in a dream he had. Unfortunately, his premonition came true. While filming a scene involving a helicopter, the aircraft crashed and decapitated him. 2 child actors were also killed, prompting a lengthy investigation and court case. In court, they revealed that the movie's concept artist had unintentionally drawn an identical image in his sketches, showing a burned-out helicopter in a river, essentially foreshadowing the accident. This led to civil and criminal action against the filmmakers for nearly a decade. One father testified he heard John Landis, the director, instructing the pilot to fly lower. The parents testified they were never told about helicopters or explosives, being assured there would only be noise. Ultimately, Landis and 4 crew members were found not guilty of manslaughter. marking the first time a director faced charges for a set fatality. The 1976 film The Omen is another classic about a young boy named Damien Thorn, who is replaced at birth by his father after their biological child dies. As violent deaths occur and Damien grows, they learn he is the Antichrist. The film was almost shut down due to an alleged curse. So many horrible things happened on set that they rivaled the movie itself. The tragedies began when lead actor Gregory Peck's son took his own life as filming started. Next, a crew member was severely injured in a car crash on his way to the set. But the tragedies did not stop there. The scriptwriter's airplane was struck by lightning en route to the film's location, and if that were not enough, an airplane in which Gregory Peck and the movie's executive producer were traveling in was also struck by lightning in a separate incident. Harvey Bernhard, the producer, was on location in Rome when he was almost hit by a bolt of lightning himself. And believe it or not, the horrible luck involving airplanes continued, and it got much worse. One day, the crew had decided to use a private airplane to get from one film location to another. However, just after the plane took off with a number of the crew on board, something went wrong, and the plane went down, crashing into a road and hitting a car, which then crashed at a high speed into another vehicle. All 11 people involved in the accident were killed. Another tragic death was that of Liz Moore. John Richardson, the special effects expert, was driving through the Netherlands with Moore when they had a terrible car accident. Richardson escaped with minor injuries, but Moore was decapitated when a tire smashed into their vehicle. This was eerily reminiscent of a scene in the film, where a character investigating Damien's origins is decapitated by a sheet of glass. Richardson later reported that right before the crash, he passed a road sign that read Omen 66.6 kilometers. Whether it was a curse or an outrageous coincidence, there is no denying the creepy connection. All that can be said for sure is that these films have left a lasting mark on cinema history, and the chilling tales that surround their productions have only helped to cement their dark and haunting legacy. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. Until next time, see ya. I was 21 when this happened. The year was 2017. At the time, I was working part-time at a gas station that was located a few towns over from where I actually lived. It was not a permanent career choice for me. In fact, it was just one of those temporary jobs that I only planned to keep for a few months. I was just trying to pay my bills and save up some money until I finally figured out what I wanted to do next in my life. The daytime shifts at the gas station were usually pretty easy. They were mostly filled with ordinary tasks like ringing up snacks, sodas, and cigarettes. Occasionally, some people would come in to pay for their gas in cash, but it was mostly just normal, boring customer service. During the day, the job could be annoying, but it felt completely normal. The nights, however, were a completely different story. The night shifts dragged on forever. The entire place felt way too bright on the inside, while the outside world was pitch black. The contrast was always unsettling. It felt like being on a stage where anyone outside could see me, but I could not see them at all. To make matters worse, every customer who walked through the door after dark seemed just a little bit stranger than the last. On the night of this specific incident, I was working the closing shift entirely by myself. It is a night that I still think about all the time, even now, years later. The store was scheduled to close at midnight. The evening started out quiet, but everything changed around 9 or 10 at night. At that point, the landline phone on the counter started ringing. I answered it without thinking anything of it. It was a normal part of the job to get calls about store hours or gas prices. But the second I picked up the receiver and held it to my ear, I heard this incredibly weird voice. It was low and drawn out, like someone trying to sound like a killer in a horror movie. It reminded me right away of Ghostface from the movie Scream. It sounded really forced, almost like someone was using a cheap voice changer, or just doing a really bad impression. But even though it sounded fake, it was still very unsettling to hear when you are alone in a quiet store. The voice slowly asked if I was all alone in the store. I just stayed quiet for a second, trying to process if this was a joke. Then, I said something sarcastic like, "Yeah, you got me," and then I hung up the phone. I figured it had to be one of my friends messing with me. They knew I worked the late shift, and they were always looking for ways to play pranks. I immediately pulled out my cell phone and texted our group chat. I asked them which one of them was calling the store pretending to be a serial killer. They all found it funny and acted confused at first. One of them texted back asking what I was talking about. Another friend said he was at home playing video games. I assumed they were just lying to me, because that would have been the obvious response if they wanted to keep the prank going. I figured they wanted to see how long they could keep me on edge. About 10 minutes later, the landline phone rang again. I picked it up, and sure enough, it was that exact same fake horror movie voice. This time, the person on the other end asked why I had hung up on them. I was starting to get a little annoyed, so I once again sarcastically said, "All right, you got me, very funny." But instead of laughing like a friend would, the voice let out this soft laugh that sounded weirdly real. It was not a playful chuckle, it was quiet, dry, and incredibly cold, and then the caller said, "I should not be rude to people who know where I am." I hung up the phone again, but this time I felt a little off. The sarcasm was gone. It was probably still a joke, but there was something about how calm and steady the person sounded that really got to me. I kept trying to shake the feeling off. Luckily, customers were still coming in at that point, which was enough to keep me distracted. People were getting gas, buying beer, and getting lottery tickets. But every single time the customer flow slowed down, I found myself staring at that phone. And then, it rang a third time around 10:40. I answered it, and I immediately regretted doing so. The voice did not even wait for me to speak. It just asked if the store always got this quiet this late at night. That question got under my skin more than I want to admit. I stood there, paralyzed, saying absolutely nothing, and then I slammed the phone back onto its cradle. After that, I texted my friends again. This time I was not being playful. I told them it was getting old and demanded to know who was doing it. Once again, they all denied it. I started messaging them one by one to see if I could catch someone in a lie. But the answers I got seemed too genuine. One of my friends was out with his girlfriend, and even sent a quick photo of them at a restaurant. Another friend sent me a real-time picture of himself in his basement. Another was at a friend's house almost half an hour away. At that point, I started getting annoyed instead of scared. I thought maybe my friends had asked someone else to do it, someone whose voice I would not recognize. But the truth was, even though the caller never once said my name, he was saying things that perfectly matched what was happening in the store. He knew exactly how quiet it was. Around 11 o'clock, the calls started coming closer together. I decided I was done playing this game, so I stopped answering after the fifth call. The phone would ring, and I would just stand there, staring at the flashing red light on the receiver, letting it ring until it stopped on its own. But the problem was, a minute or two later, it would just start ringing again. This went on for about 15 minutes. The constant ringing in the empty store was driving me crazy. I started checking the security cameras more frequently. We had a few cameras positioned around the outside of the building, and a few on the inside. The store sat entirely by itself, off a country road that got pretty dead at night. There was a small patch of thick woods directly behind one side of the building, and an alleyway area where the garbage dumpster was located. The outside cameras were not great. They had massive blind spots, and the picture quality at night was incredibly grainy and dark. Still, I kept flipping through the camera channels on the monitor, half expecting to catch one of my friends crouched outside in the dark, laughing into their phone, but I did not see anyone out there. And then I started hearing little sounds outside. At first I told myself it was just the wind or the old building settling. I heard a faint tap somewhere on the exterior wall. Then I heard what sounded like a light scrape near the side of the building. A few moments later, there was a noise by the back door that sounded exactly like someone stepping on loose gravel. It got to a point where I could not dismiss it as nothing anymore. I texted the group chat again and told them to seriously stop because they were crossing the line. I even took a picture of the empty store from where I was standing and wrote that this was not funny anymore. They kept denying it. One of my friends actually called me from his normal phone number. I answered, and I could hear the sincerity in his voice. I told him everything that was happening. He sounded genuinely confused and insisted he was not joking, nor was he involved in any prank. He told me that if I was really scared, I should just lock the front door early. I did not want to do that because my boss was very strict, and I did not want to get fired over what might just be me overreacting. Part of me still desperately wanted to believe I was making too much out of nothing. But then, at around 11:40, one last customer came into the store. I remember the exact sound of the front door chime opening because it made me jump. I looked up quickly and saw just a regular-looking guy walk in. He looked like he was in his late 20s or early 30s. There was nothing outwardly crazy or threatening about him. He was not dirty, and he was not dressed weirdly. He just had this completely blank expression on his face. He did not say hello, and he did not make eye contact. He just walked right past me and started moving through the aisles. I watched him on the security cameras, while trying to pretend like I was just doing my job. He took way too long for someone who ended up buying a single bag of chips. He kept slowly drifting from aisle to aisle, stopping and staring at the shelves. More than once, I saw the top half of his face appear just above the shelves as he looked toward the checkout counter. He was not looking in a casual way either. I felt like he was checking on me, monitoring my movements. I kept trying to rationalize it. I thought maybe he was high. Maybe he was just incredibly tired after a long day of work. Or maybe he was just having a hard time deciding what he wanted to buy. But my stomach had this incredibly heavy, sinking feeling by then. It was like my body already knew something was terribly wrong before my brain was willing to admit it. The man was in the store for at least 8 or 9 minutes. Finally, he came up to the counter and placed a bag of chips in front of me. He still did not say a word, so I did not say anything either. I just took the chips, scanned them, and looked down at the register screen. For 1 second, everything felt normal. But then I looked up to tell him the total, and I caught him staring directly into my eyes. He held my gaze for about 2 seconds. That does not sound like a long time, but when you are in a situation like that, 2 seconds feels like an eternity. There was absolutely no expression on his face when he did it. It was completely vacant. Then, without a word, he looked down and handed me the cash. I quickly scanned the money, handed him his change and his bag, and he turned around and walked toward the door. I let out a breath I did not realize I was holding. I remember thinking to myself that maybe I was just overreacting. Maybe he was just a socially awkward guy. But right as he got to the door and pushed it halfway open, he stopped. And then he turned his head back toward me without fully turning his body around. His chin was slightly lowered, so his eyes had to look up at me. And then he smiled. I still do not know how to explain that smile without sounding dramatic. It looked incredibly forced, wide, and artificial. It looked like he knew exactly how creepy he looked, and he was doing it entirely on purpose. It made every single hair on my body stand up. Then he stepped outside. But instead of walking toward any of the gas pumps or toward a parked car, he began walking around the side of the building. As he did it, he kept his eyes locked on me through the front glass windows. He kept that horrible smile on his face, too. I just stood there frozen, watching him until the angle of the wall cut off my view. I rushed over to the camera monitor and began flipping through the channels to follow his path. I saw him round the corner of the building and head toward the side where the thick woods were. And then he disappeared into the massive blind spot directly behind the building. He did not come back out. I waited 10 seconds, then 20, then a full minute. He never reappeared on any of the other cameras. That was enough for me. I did not care about my boss or getting fired anymore. I locked the front door immediately, even though it was a few minutes before midnight. This next part might sound dramatic, but I texted my family and my friends and told them that there was a creepy guy outside and that I was not joking around anymore. I told them that if I stopped replying to their messages, it meant something bad had probably happened to me because of him. I rushed through the closing procedures as fast as I possibly could. I barely cleaned the counters, and I did not restock anything. I kept checking the cameras over and over again, expecting to see his face pop up in the glass of the front door. But there was nothing. My night finally hit, and I decided I could not stay in that building for another second. I grabbed my keys and my backpack, turned off the main lights, and went to the front door. I unlocked it, stepped outside into the cold air, and immediately locked it behind me. That moment of having to turn my back to the dark parking lot to relock the door was so tense, I felt like my heart was going to burst. Once the key turned, I took off running toward my car, which was parked off to the far side of the building. I got most of the way there, but just as I reached the driver's side door and slowed down for a split second to grab the handle, I heard fast footsteps. It was not the sound of someone running, it was worse somehow. It was the sound of rapid, heavy speed-walking steps, slapping loudly against the pavement in front of the store. I whipped my head around and I saw him. It was that same guy. He had just come around the front corner of the building, and he was moving toward me and my car at an incredibly fast pace. I yanked my car door open, threw myself inside, and slammed it shut. I locked the doors and shoved the key into the ignition, turning it so fast I almost flooded the engine. The second the car started, I threw it into reverse and peeled out of that parking lot, leaving black tire marks on the asphalt. I looked once in my rearview mirror as I sped away, and I saw him standing there, illuminated by the bright headlights of my car, just watching me leave. The entire drive home, I was sending panicked voice texts and regular texts to my friends and family, telling them that I was right, that I knew he was going to come out of nowhere, and that none of this had been a prank. The next day, I texted my boss and told him exactly what had happened. I told him in no uncertain terms that I was never working the overnight shift again. He reviewed the security footage later that afternoon, and his response honestly made me even angrier. He got very defensive and told me that the guy just looked like a regular customer to him. He suggested that maybe I had just gotten spooked because of the weird phone calls, and that I was connecting things that were not actually connected. That pissed me off more than I can explain. I was the one who was there. I was the one who had been receiving those creepy phone calls. I was the one who saw that man disappear around the back of the building. And I was the one who saw him speed walking toward me out of the darkness when I tried to leave. I did not care if the grainy footage did not fully capture how terrifying it felt, because I knew what had happened. I quit the job right after that. I did not even argue with my boss. I just told him that if he thought that was normal, he was welcome to work the closing shift himself. I entered that job with a good attitude, and I left it with one too, because I knew I had saved myself. Even now, many years later, I still believe that the caller on the phone and the guy who came into the store were the exact same person, even if I can never actually prove it. Now, let me tell you about another story that happened to a woman named Cadence. Cadence worked the closing shift at a small dive bar in a quieter, more rural part of her town. The bar was located right off the main highway, but the parking lot also had a back entrance that was easily accessible to the general town. It was not a fancy establishment by any means. It was just a dimly lit, cozy spot where the regulars all knew each other by name, and the old jukebox had been playing the same rotation of classic rock songs for years. Most of the customers were local residents, truckers passing through, and the occasional lost tourist looking for a stiff drink before continuing their journey. Cadence actually liked working there. The routine was highly predictable. The tips were surprisingly decent, and she had learned over the years how to handle the usual bar crowds. She knew how to talk to the chatty customers, how to brush off the flirty ones, how to serve the quiet drinkers, and how to respect the space of the ones who just wanted to be left alone. The weekends at the bar were obviously a lot more hectic and fast-paced, but the thing about working during the week was that Cadence was expected to handle her night shifts completely alone. The owner did not even hire a barback to pop in now and again to help her wash glasses or restock ice. It was easier work and much slower during the weekdays. But Cadence often missed the company of having a coworker around. Because she was alone, she tended to be pretty vigilant during her shifts. The bar attracted a rough crowd sometimes, and she knew that a fight could break out at any moment. That was why she clocked the man immediately when he walked in. It was sometime after 1 o'clock in the morning on a quiet Tuesday when the front door opened. If Cadence had to guess, she would say the man was in his late 40s. But what stood out was how extremely clean-cut and well-groomed he was. He did not have the rugged look you would expect from a guy his age in an area like this. He was wearing a black turtleneck underneath a long, expensive-looking black trench coat. He was definitely well-dressed, but he wore it in a casual way. It is hard to explain, but he had this distinct aura of sophistication about him that made you think of money. Real money, not the loud, flashy kind, but the quiet, generational kind. He stood at the entrance for a moment, glancing around the empty bar slowly, before walking swiftly over to the counter and taking a seat. Cadence noticed he had oddly good, rigid posture, but she did not think too much of it at the time. When she walked over to take his order, he glanced at the premium bottles on the shelf behind her and ordered a top-shelf drink without any hesitation. As she was pouring the liquor, the man looked at her with a polite smile and asked if she liked working here. It was a normal enough question for a bartender to receive, so Cadence answered him honestly. She told him that she did, smiled back, and even made a light-hearted joke about the trials of being a bartender. Looking back, she wishes she could say she got a creepy vibe from him right away, but that was not the energy he was giving off at all. He genuinely seemed like a stand-up guy, very polite and charming. He chatted with her for a few minutes, which Cadence did not mind because the bar was practically empty at that point, and it helped pass the time. But then, the conversation took a slightly strange turn. The man asked her if she had ever thought about doing something bigger with her life. Cadence admitted that it was a somewhat bizarre thing for a stranger to ask, but given the friendly nature of the conversation, she did not find it totally creepy. She just gave him her standard, polite bartender smile and told him that she was happy with where she was for now. The man nodded slowly and took a sip of his drink. He seemed almost disappointed by her answer, though Cadence could not understand why. After a long, quiet pause, he looked at her and asked what time she got off work. That question caught her off guard. She had not picked up on any kind of flirting or romantic interest from him during their conversation, so she felt a sudden wave of disappointment. She realized that this pleasant chat had probably just been another empty, calculated attempt to get her phone number. She smiled politely and gave him a vague, non-committal answer, trying to brush him off in a friendly way without seeming uptight or rude. Before he could press the issue, she busied herself by grabbing a towel and wiping down the opposite end of the counter. The man did not push for more information. He just smiled, as if he already knew exactly what she was thinking. He then drained the rest of his drink, pulled a crisp $100 bill from his pocket, and laid it gently on the bar counter. Without another word, he stood up, turned, and walked out into the cold night. Cadence did not really know what to make of the brief encounter. It seemed like nothing major, but the man's demeanor was just so far off her usual radar that she found herself thinking about him. Either way, she figured she was never going to see him again, so she cleaned his glass and got on with her life. But as it would turn out, she was completely wrong. About a week later, during another quiet weekday shift, the front door opened, and the man walked back in. Only this time, he was not alone. There was a woman walking right beside him. The woman immediately drew Cadence's attention, because she had never seen her in the bar before. She looked like she was in her mid-30s, but she was dressed in a way that did not quite match her age. It was trendy, but off, like someone who was trying just a little bit too hard to blend in with a much younger crowd. Cadence watched them closely as they approached the bar. Everything about the woman's movements seemed highly calculated, from the way she smiled too easily to the way she leaned casually against the bar counter as if they were already close friends. As Cadence walked over and began setting down paper napkins in front of them, the very first thing the woman did was pay her a compliment. She did not say hello, and she did not order a drink. Instead, she put on an overly joyful, beaming smile and said, "You are so pretty." As she said those words, her fingers brushed gently against Cadence's arm, lingering there for just a second longer than normal. Cadence laughed politely and thanked her, but she instantly felt a wave of unease. Something was incredibly off about this woman. The man, on the other hand, did not speak at all. This was also very strange considering how talkative and charming he had been during his first visit. He just sat there quietly, watching. They ordered their drinks, and as Cadence poured them, the woman began peppering her with questions. She asked how long Cadence had been working at the bar, how old she was, and several other personal questions. Cadence answered in short, polite, but guarded sentences. She got the distinct sense that this was not just innocent small talk. The woman was studying her, analyzing her responses. At one point, the woman looked over at the man, and it seemed like they were communicating silently, sharing a look despite not saying a word to each other. The woman then looked back at Cadence, leaned in a bit closer over the counter, and lowered her voice as if she did not want any other patrons in the bar to overhear. She told Cadence that she ran an exclusive, high-end event club. She said she was always on the lookout for young, fun, and attractive people to work private parties. She claimed that Cadence could make a killing doing this, mentioning that she could easily earn $10,000 for just a single weekend of work. Cadence let out a small, forced laugh. She told the woman that it sounded a little bit too good to be true, but the woman insisted it was completely real. She said a bunch of girls just like Cadence worked for them and loved it. The woman's wide, beaming smile never faltered for a single second, and that was what was starting to really creep Cadence out. The woman kept steering the conversation back to the job, circling around the same reassuring words over and over again. She kept saying it was fun, safe, and highly exclusive. And then, very casually, the woman said, "You should step outside with us for just a second. There is someone in the car who can explain how it works much better than I can." At that moment, Cadence's pulse kicked up. She realized this was not a normal job offer. She stopped playing along. She did not even bother pretending like she was not creeped out anymore. She looked the woman dead in the eye, dropping her polite smile, and said, "I am good," in a very firm, serious voice. Just then, a group of loud, laughing customers walked through the front door of the bar. The woman's expression changed in an instant. Her friendly, joyful mask slipped for a split second, revealing a cold, annoyed look. She quickly turned to the man beside her, and without saying another word, the two of them stood up and walked out of the bar. Cadence would be lying if she said she was not deeply unsettled after that night. Two random strangers had essentially just tried to lure her out of her workplace and into a car for God knows what. She immediately told her coworkers and her boss about the incident. They all agreed to keep a close eye out in case those two people ever returned. Her boss assured her that he only lived a 15-minute drive away, and that she could call him at any time if she felt unsafe. He also pointed out that the bar had high-quality security cameras, which were typically enough to deter any bad behavior. There was not much else Cadence could do. After all, the people had not technically done anything illegal. They had just asked some weird questions and made a strange job offer. She tried to push the whole thing out of her mind. But a few nights later, after she had closed up the bar and was preparing to leave, she noticed a car parked directly across the street. The engine was completely off, the headlights were dark, and it was just sitting there in the shadows. She tried to tell herself it was just a random person resting, but the overwhelming feeling of being watched crawled over her skin like static electricity. She kept her head down, clutched her keys tightly between her knuckles, and walked quickly to her vehicle. When she pulled out of the parking lot, she kept a close eye on her mirrors. Sure enough, the dark car pulled out too. It followed her. The driver stayed back just enough to avoid looking obvious, but every single turn Cadence made, the car made too. To test her theory, she took a sudden random turn onto a quiet side street. The car followed. She took another turn. It was still there, trailing her every move. At this point, she was absolutely freaking out internally. She knew beyond a shadow of a doubt that it was them. She forced herself to stay calm and think logically. Instead of driving toward her home and showing them where she lived, she navigated her way toward the nearest police station. She gripped the steering wheel so tightly that her knuckles turned completely white. The very second she turned into the bright, camera-heavy parking lot of the police station, the car behind her sped off into the darkness. Nothing happened for a while after that. Cadence started to think that maybe they had finally given up and moved on to someone else. But deep down, she knew it was not over, and she was right. It was a slow, rainy weekday shift, and barely anyone had come into the bar all night. By midnight, Cadence was wiping down the counter, seriously contemplating closing up early and going home, when the heavy front door creaked open. She looked up, and her heart stopped. It was the woman. Cadence kept her cool. She slowly reached into her pocket, pulled out her phone, and sent a quick, urgent text to her boss under the counter, making sure to be as inconspicuous as possible. When she looked back up, the woman was staring directly at her with that same artificial plastic smile. She walked slowly across the empty floor, took a seat at the bar, and folded her hands neatly on the counter. Cadence was debating whether she should just openly tell the woman to leave when the woman spoke. She said, "Thought I would come check on you." Cadence's stomach started twisting into knots, but she did her best to hide her sheer terror. She looked at the woman and told her that the bar was about to close and that she needed to leave. But the woman made a mock pouty face and pleaded, "Oh, come on, just one old-fashioned before you close up." Cadence thought about refusing her, but then she realized that if she poured the drink, it would stall the woman and keep her in one place long enough for her boss to arrive. So she turned her back, grabbed a glass, and began preparing the drink, trying her absolute best to keep her hands from shaking. And then she heard it. It was the soft, unmistakable click of the front door shutting. Cadence whipped around instantly. The bar stool was completely empty. The woman was gone. A horrible, heavy pit formed in her stomach. She slowly stepped out from behind the counter and walked toward the glass entrance. She looked out into the dark parking lot, and there it was. A large black van was idling just outside the front door. Without thinking, Cadence rushed forward and locked the deadbolt on the front door as quickly as she could. But then, a loud, violent metal rattling sound erupted from the back of the building. Someone was aggressively shaking the handle of the back exit door, trying to force their way in. Cadence panicked. She knew she did not have time to run. She grabbed the heaviest object within reach, a heavy metal cocktail shaker, and clutched it like a weapon. With her other hand, she dialed 911, but she knew the police station was too far away to get there in time. She thought about making a run for it out the front door, but she was too terrified of the black van waiting there. She stood in the center of the bar, bracing herself for a fight, when she saw bright headlights pull into the parking lot. It was her boss's truck. The violent rattling on the back door suddenly stopped. A second later, the black van pulled out of the parking lot with a loud screech of its tires, disappearing down the highway. When her boss walked in, Cadence threw her arms around him, sobbing as she explained what had just happened. When the police finally arrived, her boss sat down with them and reviewed the security footage from that night. What they saw on the monitors was infinitely worse than anything Cadence had imagined. The cameras showed that just before the woman exited the bar, two tall, masked figures had crept up to the building and crouched down near the front door, waiting in the shadows. Meanwhile, a third masked man had gone to the back of the building and was violently banging on the door with his fists. It became chillingly clear what their plan had been. They were trying to terrify Cadence, using the back door noise to flush her out of the building through the front door, where the two masked men and the black van were waiting to snatch her. It was a perfectly coordinated, horrifying trap. To make matters worse, the license plate number that her boss had managed to write down as the van fled turned out to be completely unregistered. It has been quite a while since that terrifying night, and the police have made absolutely zero progress in identifying the suspects. The only good thing to come out of the whole situation is that Cadence's boss no longer makes her work the closing shifts alone. But despite having company, she still gets incredibly uneasy anytime she is scheduled to work at night. She constantly questions how those people knew she would be alone on those specific nights. It still makes no sense to her, and even now she often lies awake at night, thinking about what would have happened to her if she had given into her fear and run out that front door. Now, let us move on to a third story. This one involves a young man who used to work the night shift at a quiet gas station and convenience store located off a lonely, desolate stretch of a major highway. He stresses the word "used to," because after what happened to him a few months ago, he has vowed never to work a night shift ever again. The station was very small, the kind of place that barely gets any business at all once the sun goes down. Most of his 6-hour shift was spent doing mundane tasks like restocking shelves, wiping down dusty counters, and occasionally ringing up a passing truck driver or a weary traveler. He remembers the night of the incident vividly. It was just past 2:30 in the morning. By that time, even the highway traffic had completely dried up, and he was left with absolutely nothing to do. He sat behind the counter, mindlessly scrolling through social media on his phone just to kill the remaining hours of his shift. At one point, he decided he needed some fresh air to wake himself up. He stepped outside onto the concrete pavement, rubbing his hands together to fight off the biting cold. He exhaled slowly, watching his breath form white clouds that quickly disappeared into the freezing night air. The parking lot was completely empty. There were just the yellow gas pumps, the empty asphalt, the dark highway, and a massive thick stretch of pine trees directly across the road. The bright neon sign of the gas station flickered faintly, making a low buzzing sound. It was incredibly hazy outside, the kind of night where you could literally see the thick moisture hanging in the air. Even with the highway nearby, the silence out there was heavy and suffocating. Right as the employee was about to turn around and walk back inside the warm store, he noticed a sudden movement out of the corner of his eye. He whipped his head around, searching the darkness. That was when he realized there was a person standing directly behind one of the far gas pumps. He was completely frozen. How had he not noticed this person earlier? The figure was wearing a dark red hoodie with the hood pulled up high over his face, and he had both of his hands shoved deep into his front pockets. There was not a single car in the parking lot, which meant this guy had not driven here, and he certainly was not fueling up a vehicle. The strangest part was that he did not seem to be heading toward the convenience store either. He was just standing there in the shadows, half turned toward the building, staring directly at the employee. The employee felt a wave of unease. At first he tried to rationalize it, figuring maybe the guy's car had run out of gas nearby, and he was just waiting for a friend to arrive. But something about the way the man was moving rubbed him completely the wrong way. The hooded figure was slowly shuffling back and forth in a weird, tight circular pattern, never taking his eyes off the store. The employee quickly walked back inside the building. He made sure to keep a close eye on the stranger through the large glass windows, pretending to organize the candy racks while secretly monitoring him. He hoped and prayed that a car would pull up and pick the guy up, or that another customer would arrive to break the tension. But after a few agonizing minutes, the man in the red hoodie started walking toward the front door. He walked slowly at first, but then he suddenly pushed through the glass door, walking inside as if he had made up his mind all at once. He walked straight up to the counter, but instead of asking for something, he just stood there, saying absolutely nothing. He just stared at the employee, his eyes cold and calculating, as if he was sizing him up. Then, in a rushed, stuttering, and almost rehearsed-sounding voice, he muttered that his car had broken down just past the highway entrance. He said he needed a jump start, or maybe just a small can of gas, so he could make it to the next town. The employee was completely shocked by the request, but the problem was, the guy was not even trying to make his story sound believable. The employee could not believe the stranger actually expected him to buy this obvious lie. There was no emotion in the man's face, and his explanation felt completely scripted. Trying to stay professional, the employee offered to call a professional tow truck company to come help him out. No, the man said, speaking far too quickly and shaking his head vigorously. He said he did not want a tow truck. He claimed he just needed to borrow a flashlight and maybe get some physical help checking under his hood. At this point, the employee knew something was terribly wrong. The way the man spoke, the nervous way he watched the employee's every reaction, it felt like some sort of test. But then again, people who walk into highway gas stations at 3 in the morning are often a bit strange. The employee started to wonder if the guy actually did need help and was just socially awkward, or perhaps under the influence of something. He asked the man exactly where his car was parked. The man pointed out the window and said it was parked just beyond the highway entrance ramp. The employee was highly skeptical, but then the man pointed at the security camera monitor hanging behind the cash register. I turned to look at the screen, and to my utter surprise, there actually was a car parked out there on the shoulder of the road. For a split second, the employee thought to himself, "Oh crap, maybe this guy really is telling the truth and actually needs my help." But then, a terrifying realization hit him. He had literally just been standing outside in the parking lot, seconds before this man walked in. It was a completely empty, silent night. There was absolutely no way a car had driven up, parked by the highway ramp, and shut its engine off without him hearing it. It was physically impossible. He slowly glanced back at the security monitor, looking closer at the grainy image of the parked vehicle. And that was when he saw it. There was a tiny, subtle movement near the car's back bumper. Someone was crouching down in the dirt, completely hidden in the darkness, just out of view of the highway. A cold wave of pure dread washed over him. He knew that if he walked out of that store to help this man, he was walking straight into an ambush. He forced a casual, friendly smile onto his face and agreed to help the guy. But he told him that he first needed to grab his heavy-duty flashlight and his cell phone from the back office. He turned around slowly, making sure not to show any panic or do anything that might spook the man. But the very second his body was out of the man's direct line of sight, he reached under the counter and slammed his hand onto the emergency panic button. The loud, piercing security alarm went off instantly, its high-pitched screech echoing deafeningly throughout the small store. The employee braced himself, expecting the man in the red hoodie to leap over the counter and attack him. But what the man did instead was even more terrifying. All of his nervous, twitchy energy vanished in an instant. There was no more fake urgency. There was no more shifting nervously from foot to foot. Instead, his entire body relaxed. His posture loosened up, and his hands came slowly out of his pockets. And then he smiled. It was not a panicked smile, and it was not an embarrassed one either. It was a slow, wide, knowing grin. He looked at the employee as if the alarm was highly amusing to him, as if he had all the time in the world. The employee stood there in absolute shock, paralyzed by the sheer creepiness of the man's reaction. In one fluid, athletic motion, the man turned around and bolted out the front door. The employee ran to the camera monitors, watching the screens in horror. He saw the man in the red hoodie sprint across the pavement, but he did not run toward the parked car. Instead, he and the crouched figure from the back bumper both took off sprinting into the pitch-black woods behind the gas station. The parked car just sat there, its engine off and its headlights dark, completely abandoned. By the time the police arrived, the scene was exactly as the employee had described. The stolen car was still parked on the shoulder, but the men had completely vanished. The officers searched the tree line, but there were no clear footprints leading into the thick brush, and no sign of the suspects anywhere. But then, one of the responding officers pointed something out on the car that the employee had not noticed before. The front passenger door of the vehicle was slightly ajar. There had been a third person sitting inside the dark car the entire time, waiting for the signal. The police took the employee's detailed statement and gathered the surveillance footage. A few days later, a detective followed up with him. They had towed the car and run the license plates. It turned out the vehicle had been reported stolen nearly a week earlier, over 100 miles away. No one ever came forward to claim it, and there were no missing persons reports or other crimes linked to the vehicle. It was just a stolen car abandoned in the middle of nowhere by 3 phantom men who disappeared into the dark woods. That happened months ago, and the police still have no leads. The employee quit his job immediately, and he now warns everyone to never work the night shift. Finally, let us look at the fourth story, which took place just a couple of weeks ago at a massive Walmart store. The narrator of this story works the night shift there. She explains that while it is not the worst job in the world, after a while, it really starts to feel like you are just floating through time. The nights all blend together into one continuous loop of the same shelves, the same routine, and the same dull, depressing hum of the bright overhead fluorescent lights. She is constantly hoping that a better job opportunity will come along soon. She is typically assigned to stock and organize the electronics section. She actually prefers this area because it is much quieter and more isolated than the rest of the store. People do not exactly come rushing into Walmart at 2 o'clock in the morning to buy phone chargers, headphones, or Bluetooth speakers. Most of the nighttime customers are either night owls killing time or truck drivers grabbing last-minute supplies before hitting the highway again. Because the section was so empty, she noticed the man almost immediately. At first, she did not think much of it. He just looked like another random customer wandering the aisles, perhaps waiting for a family member to finish shopping in another part of the store. But after a few minutes had passed, she realized that he was not actually shopping. In fact, he was not even pretending to look at the merchandise. He just kept appearing. Every single time she glanced up from the boxes she was unpacking, he was standing nearby. He was always hovering in the next aisle over, or standing a little too still by the clearance rack. He was not looking at the products on display. He was just standing there, completely still, watching her. She tried to tell herself that she was just being paranoid and overthinking the situation. Walmart is a massive store, and maybe the guy was just taking his time. But there was something about the way he moved that set off a deep, primal alarm in her gut. He always stayed just close enough for her to notice his presence, but he never actually picked up an item or approached her. It was highly unsettling, It was almost like he wanted her to know that he was watching her, which made absolutely no sense to do. She waited for him to just get it over with, assuming he was just a creepy guy trying to build up the courage to ask for her phone number. But he never did. She decided she was going to radio her manager to report the suspicious behavior. But when she reached for her walkie-talkie and tried to turn it on, she realized the batteries were completely dead. It was not working at all. She stood there, debating whether she should walk away from her section to go find a manager in person. But before she could make a decision, she felt a sudden firm hand wrap around her arm. She nearly jumped out of her skin in terror, but before she could scream or react, a woman's voice rang out. The voice was incredibly loud, friendly, and overly familiar. The woman exclaimed, "There you are," and immediately went into a loud, energetic spiel about how she had been looking all over the store for her. The employee turned around, completely thrown off and confused. She found herself staring at a woman she had never seen before in her entire life. The woman was smiling warmly, her grip on the employee's arm firm and tight, acting as if they were two old high school friends reuniting after years apart. But before the employee could say a word to correct her, the woman leaned in very close. Her friendly expression vanished, and her voice dropped to a low, urgent whisper. She said, "That guy over there has been recording you on his phone. Follow me right now." The employee's stomach dropped. She turned her head slightly, just enough to glance back over her shoulder. Sure enough, the man in the electronics aisle was still there. Only now, he was no longer pretending to browse. He was standing in the center of the aisle, staring directly at her with a cold, intense glare. A wave of icy fear washed over the employee. She did not question the woman's story. She let the woman pull her away, clutching onto her arm. She felt a massive wave of gratitude, believing that this brave customer had noticed her being stalked and had put herself in an uncomfortable situation just to save her from a predator. As they walked quickly down the main aisle, the woman kept up her loud, friendly act, rambling on about a fictional trip they had taken and sharing fake inside jokes. The employee barely processed a single word she was saying. Her mind was entirely focused on the creepy man. Had he really been recording her? It was deeply violating. She wanted to look back to see if he was following them, but she could not muster up the courage to turn her head. The woman steered her through the massive store, moving at a very fast pace. The employee was so panicked that she barely noticed where they were going. She was just glad that the distance between her and the stalker was growing. She kept waiting for the woman to drop the act now that they were farther away, but the woman just kept pulling her forward. After a while, it started to feel a bit uncomfortable. The employee glanced back over her shoulder. To her immense relief, the creepy man was nowhere to be seen. He had not followed them. The employee slowed her pace and told the woman that they were safe now, and that they should head toward the front of the store to find a manager and call security. But the woman did not slow down. Instead, she squeezed the employee's arm even tighter, her nails digging into her skin. She whispered urgently, "No, we can't stop. He is still lurking around here somewhere. We have to keep moving." The employee started to feel a different kind of dread. She thought to herself, so what if he is still in the store? Walmart is full of other employees and overnight stalkers. What could he possibly do to her if she was standing next to her coworkers? The initial terror of being stalked was starting to fade, replaced by a strange, uneasy feeling about the woman who was holding her. She looked around, trying to figure out where they were. Her heart sank. They had moved completely past the main registers, past the self-checkout lanes, and far away from the bright aisles that saw the most employee foot traffic. They were entering the warehouse and shipping section of the store. It was incredibly dark, quiet, and completely devoid of people. And just ahead of them was the heavy metal side exit door. This was the door that did not have any security cameras, the one that employees only used for loading heavy shipments onto trucks. At that exact moment, a terrifying realization dawned on her. This woman was not trying to save her. She was leading her straight to an isolated, unmonitored exit. She did not hesitate. The employee opened her mouth and let out a blood-curdling scream for help. At the same time, she yanked her arm back with all of her physical strength, trying to break the woman's grip. The sudden, violent movement caught the woman off guard, and her fingers slipped. The employee broke free. She did not waste a single second. She turned around and sprinted as fast as her legs could carry her back toward the bright lights of the sales floor. As she ran, she heard the woman scream out behind her in a furious, angry voice. The woman yelled for her to come back, and then she yelled the employee's actual name. The employee had never introduced herself. She was not wearing her name tag that night because she had forgotten it in her locker. She kept running, her heart pounding in her chest, until she finally ran into one of her male coworkers who was rushing toward her, having heard her screams. She frantically told him to call security immediately. He did, and the store was put on high alert. But by the time the security guards searched the area, both the man and the woman were completely gone. Later that night, the security team reviewed the surveillance footage from the entire evening. What they saw on the screens made the employee's blood run cold. The footage showed that the man and the woman had walked into the Walmart together, side by side. They had been working as a team the entire time. The man's job was to stalk the employee, acting as the creepy threat to terrify her. The woman's job was to play the role of the helpful, heroic savior, gaining the employee's trust, so she would willingly follow her right out of the building and into whatever vehicle was waiting for them outside the side exit. It was a highly sophisticated, chillingly calculated kidnapping plot. The security cameras had captured a crystal clear image of the man's face, but the woman had been careful, always keeping her head turned away from the lenses. The police were called, and they officially launched an investigation into the failed abduction attempt. The employee is still waiting for updates, hoping they will identify the man from the footage. But what terrifies her the most, what keeps her awake at night, shaking with fear, is how that strange woman knew her name. They had not chosen her at random. She had been a specific, pre-selected target. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. Until next time, see ya. We all look for deals online. Craigslist is a place where you can find exactly what you need for a cheap price. But sometimes a deal is just a trap, a way for predators to lure you in, or worse, to follow you back to where you feel safest. Let us start with a young woman who was only 22 years old. She had just moved into her first apartment. It was a small place, but it was hers. The problem was that she did not have much money for furniture. She turned to Craigslist to find a cheap couch. She finally found an ad that caught her eye. It was a nice couch in great shape, and the seller was asking a low price. The ad said to contact him by email. His email address was mexicanpoppy66@hotmail.com. Now, right off the bat, she felt a little bit uneasy about that email name. It just felt weird, unprofessional, and slightly off-putting. But she really wanted that couch, so she decided to push her doubts aside and send an email with an offer. Within 5 minutes, the man responded, accepting her offer. But then he asked for her home address so he could deliver it. This made her very uncomfortable. She was a young woman living alone, and she did not want a strange man coming to her house. She emailed him back and suggested she come to his house to pick it up. But the seller was persistent. He kept insisting that he should bring it to her house. She stopped responding. A day later, he emailed her again, giving her his address. She hesitated. She knew she had a bad feeling, but the deal was too good, and he lived close by. She got in her van and drove over to his house. The house was much smaller than the other houses on the block. She walked up and rang the bell. A middle-aged man wearing a baseball cap answered the door. He gave her a huge smile and invited her in. Immediately, she felt uneasy because the house smelled musty and old. He led her into his living room, and when she saw the couch, her heart sank. It was covered in scuff marks and had several noticeable tears. It was not at all in the shape that it had appeared in the online ad. It looked dirty and neglected. She pointed this out, and he just offered to lower the price. She told him she was not interested and started making her way to the door. But as she walked out, he put his hand on her shoulder. He leaned in and offered to give it to her for free if she was willing to give him something in return. She let out a disgusted gasp, broke away, ran to her car, and drove away quickly. That same night, she was laying in her bed, watching television, when she heard someone stomping up her porch steps. She muted the TV and clearly heard someone fiddling with her front doorknob. She jumped out of bed and tiptoed to the front door to look through the peephole, but whoever it was already gone. Then she heard the gate to her backyard opening and closing. Terrified, she grabbed her phone and dialed 911. Soon after, she heard someone fiddling with the doorknob to her back door. She yelled out that the police were on their way. After that, she heard the backyard gate open and close again. The intruder was gone, disappearing into the dark. It has been a month since that terrifying night, and while nothing else has happened since then, she still cannot sleep at night. She keeps a baseball bat next to her bed and checks the locks multiple times. She is 99% sure it was the man who was selling the couch. He must have followed her home. She does not plan on using Craigslist anymore and is actively trying to find a new apartment. Our next story involves a father who is looking for a car for his son's 18th birthday. He searched typical car websites, but they were all overpriced. Craigslist was the only place to find an actual deal. About a week into his search, he found an old Toyota Camry. It had low mileage, no accidents, and was in good condition for only $3,500. This was an absolute steal. The seller lived about 10 miles away. The father called the seller to set up a time to check it out. The man sounded completely normal on the phone. He was polite and assured him that there were absolutely no mechanical problems with the car. He introduced himself as Bob. The father brought along $3,500 in cash, even though he planned on wiggling down the price as much as possible. He pulled up the dirt road to Bob's property 15 minutes early. It was a tiny house with a decent-sized lot, far from the nearest neighbors. The garage was open, so he walked over to check inside. But except for an unusual amount of car parts, the garage was empty. The Camry was nowhere in sight. The only car on the property was an old pickup truck. He walked to the front door to check the house numbers. It was the right address. The doorbell button was actually missing from the wall, leaving just exposed wires. So he knocked on the wooden front door. He stood on the porch knocking for exactly 5 minutes, looking around at the quiet property, before deciding to give the man a call. He dialed the number and heard the sound of a cell phone ringing inside the house. He was extremely confused. He knew he had the right house, but he did not understand why the man was not answering. He decided to take a peek through one of the windows. The inside of the house was very dark, but as he peered through the glass, he saw an old dining room set. Across from that, he saw a figure standing at the back door of the house, staring outside. He figured this must be Bob. He knocked on the window, but the figure did not move. There was no gate to the backyard, so he simply walked around the house. He did not understand how the man could not hear him. When he got to the back door, he made a shocking realization. The figure standing by the door was a taxidermied human being, perfectly preserved and staring blankly into the yard. A wave of absolute horror washed over him. He turned and ran straight back the way he came, sprinting toward his car. Before starting the engine and driving off, he looked up at the window one last time. The blinds had been shut, but he could see 2 of the blinds bent open. Someone was at that window watching him. He slammed his foot on the gas pedal and drove home. He realized there was never a car for sale. He was very close to becoming a lifeless statue staring out that man's back door. Our final story takes us back about a year ago. A young man was looking to buy an iPhone 5. He found a guy on Craigslist who was selling his for $200, claiming it was in mint condition. The young man did not know much about testing a phone, so he brought his little brother along, who knew a lot more. They met the seller at a Dunkin' Donuts parking lot at 10 o'clock at night. 2 large, intimidating guys stepped out of a black Honda Civic and walked slowly over to them. The atmosphere in the parking lot suddenly felt incredibly tense. One of the guys showed them the phone. It did not have a scratch. The younger brother took out their SIM card, popped it into the new phone, and tested it. He confirmed it worked. But then, the guy suddenly asked for $250, even though he originally asked for $200. The buyer lied and said he only brought $200. The seller seemed unhappy but accepted the money, and the 2 men got back in their car. The brothers got in their own car, and the buyer spent 5 minutes testing the phone by calling his girlfriend. The younger brother noticed that the 2 guys had not left yet either. The buyer started his car and pulled out of the parking lot. His brother pointed out that the 2 guys started their car at the exact same time. They drove down the turnpike, and when they stopped at a red light, the black Honda Civic pulled up right behind them. The older brother found this weird since he thought they came from the opposite direction. He continued his drive home, but every single turn he made, the Civic followed, keeping close on his tail. His brother started to panic, suggesting that they pull over right away, but the older brother refused, knowing those guys were looking for trouble. It got to the point where he was trying to lose them by driving aggressively. At an intersection, the traffic light turned red. He floored the accelerator across the intersection before the cross traffic could move. The risky move worked, and the Civic did not follow. They got home after an extra long drive, relieved to be safe. Later that night, while playing with the phone in bed, the young man heard 2 car doors slam shut outside. He looked out his window and saw the black Honda Civic parked across the street. The 2 guys were already halfway to his front door. He immediately woke up his dad and explained everything. His dad grabbed a baseball bat and stood behind the front door. A loud knock came at the door, and one of the guys outside claimed to have a gun, threatening to shoot the lock off. The father screamed at his son to call Joe, their close friend who lived just 2 doors down, who also happened to be a police officer. Joe said he would be right over. Suddenly, there was the sound of a silenced gunshot. A bullet ripped through the door, leaving a hole just inches from the father's head. The father scrambled away. Outside, they heard Joe shouting at the men to drop their weapons. The father rushed outside to help, just as the 2 men slowly lowered their guns. Joe ordered them to the ground, and successfully arrested them both right there on the grass. It was the scariest day of his life, but also the best he had ever felt once those men were in handcuffs. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. Until next time, see ya. We use our mobile phones every single day of our lives to communicate with the people we love. We send quick updates, check in on family members, and coordinate plans. But sometimes, a simple text message can become the start of a living nightmare. Today, we are looking at 3 real-life horror stories where a mobile phone became a window for absolute terror. Our first story is about a teenage girl named Emily. She lived with her parents and her older brother Peter in a quiet suburban neighborhood. On a cold Friday night, her parents went out for a rare dinner date, and Peter was scheduled to work a late shift until midnight. This meant Emily was completely home alone. She was relaxing in her bedroom upstairs, looking forward to some quiet time. At around 9 o'clock, Emily heard a distinct sound downstairs. It was the click of the front door opening and closing. She sat up, wondering if her parents had returned early. She texted her mom, "Are you home?" Her mom replied, "No, still with your dad." "What is up?" Emily asked. "Is Peter home?" Her mom wrote back, "I do not know. I have been in my room. I do not think so because he was supposed to work until 12 tonight. Are you sure you heard the door open then?" Emily quickly texted Peter to check. Peter replied almost instantly that he was still at work. Emily froze. If her parents and brother were out, then who was in her house? She crept to her bedroom door, cracked it open, and peered down the stairs. Standing in her living room was a tall stranger in his 30s, wearing a dark hoodie, a beanie, and black sweatpants. He was slowly walking around, inspecting their belongings. Terrified, Emily quietly locked her bedroom door and ran back to her bed. She texted her mom, "Mom, there is someone in the house." "What? Who is it, Mom?" "I do not know. There is some man walking around downstairs. I am scared. What do I do?" Her mother immediately replied, "Emily, find somewhere to hide right now. I am calling the police. Lock your door right now and hide somewhere in your room." Emily ran to her closet, hid under some clothes, and texted, "Okay, I am in the closet." Her mom replied, "Okay, good, sweetie. I am on the phone with the police. Do not make any noise at all. Stay in the closet until you hear the police come inside." "Do you still hear them?" Then Emily heard heavy footsteps coming up the stairs. They stopped right outside her door. The doorknob began to rattle. She texted her mom, "Mom, he is trying to open the door." Her mom replied, "Emily, please just be quiet. You are going to be okay. The police are almost there." Suddenly, a loud crash shook the door. The man was trying to break it down. Emily squeezed her eyes shut and held her breath, too terrified to make a sound or type another word. Fortunately, the slamming stopped. The intruder must have realized breaking the door was taking too long. Soon, her mom texted, "Emily, the police are there. Are you okay?" Emily heard officers shouting downstairs. They found her safe in her closet. The intruder had managed to escape through the back door before the police arrived. taking several expensive electronics and valuables with him. But because Emily had acted quickly, hid, and stayed quiet, she survived the night without being harmed. She called her mother to let her know she was okay, and her parents rushed home. It was a terrifying reminder of why keeping your doors locked is so critical. Our second story takes us to another home, where a young woman we will call Amanda was about to experience a very different kind of home invasion. One afternoon, Amanda was relaxing at home when she received an unexpected text from a guy named Jake. She knew Jake casually through mutual friends, but they had never really spoken one-on-one. The conversation started simply. Jake texted, "Hey, what are you doing?" Amanda replied, "Nothing. What about you?" Jake wrote back, "Same. Want to hang out?" Amanda was a bit intrigued and replied, "Maybe. What do you want to do?" Jake explained that they could not hang out at his place because his parents were home and asked, "What if I came to you? Are your parents home?" Amanda replied, "Nope." Jake immediately wrote, "So, let me come, lol." Amanda asked when, and Jake said he was free now. Amanda asked, "What made you even think to hit me up?" Jake sent back, "You are really pretty and I just want to hang out with you." Amanda smiled and replied, "Okay. I look like a potato right now, so you have to give me some time to get ready." Jake asked for her address and she sent it. Jake replied, "Word, I will head over soon." Realizing she needed more time, Amanda quickly texted, "Wait, no, don't. I need time to get ready." But Jake left her message unread. At the same time, Amanda decided to text her close friend Alyssa to tell her about this sudden development. She texted, "OMG, he randomly hit me up and he wants to come over." Alyssa asked, "Are you going to let him?" Amanda replied, "I told him, yeah, but to let me get ready. He said he is going to head over soon. I told him wait, but he left me on scene." Instead of sharing her excitement, Alyssa reacted with immediate suspicion. She texted, "Wait, hang on. I feel like it is weird that he is texting you. I am going to call him." Amanda asked her not to mention her name, but Alyssa soon replied, "He is not picking up FaceTime anyway. I am calling Jamie." "This is weird." Amanda asked why it was so weird, and Alyssa replied, "Because I know he wouldn't just text you like that." You see, Alyssa knew that Jake was on the verge of officially dating another girl in their friend group, and he would never randomly message Amanda to hang out. Alyssa called Jake's sister, Jamie, to find out what was going on. A few minutes later, Alyssa sent a text to Amanda that read, "OMFG," and then called her immediately. On the phone, Alyssa explained that Jamie had just revealed that Jake actually lost his phone the previous morning during his run, and his Find My iPhone was disabled. Amanda felt a wave of horror. The person she was texting was not Jake. It was a complete stranger who now knew she was a young girl home alone, and he had her exact address. Just then, her phone buzzed with another text from Jake's number. "I am here. I am at the door." Amanda froze. She crept to the front door and looked through the peephole. Standing on her porch was a hooded figure, staring directly back at the peephole. Amanda knew she had to act fast. She texted the stolen phone. "I know this phone was stolen. I called the cops already. They are almost here. You better get out of here and never come back or you will be sorry. We also have you on video camera, so wave hello." Through the peephole, she saw the stranger read the text, freeze for a moment, and then quickly run away. The police later used the phone's identification number to track it to a man living a town over, who was arrested and prosecuted. Our final story involves a single mother named Marissa Rivera. Marissa was fast asleep in her bed at around 1 o'clock on a Friday night when she was suddenly awoken by her phone vibrating on her nightstand. On the screen was a series of frantic text messages from her son. John, the text read, "Mom, I need help. I got into a car accident. Can you come pick me up? I think I injured my elbow. The damage is pretty bad. I do not know what to do." Marissa sat up, her heart pounding with worry. She quickly replied, "Please tell me you are joking. Are you okay?" The reply came back, "Yes, my elbow just hurts," Marissa asked. "Where are you?" the sender replied. "At the intersection of Roberson Street and Humphrey Lane by Longley Supply." Marissa asked, "Is Kevin with you?" The text said, "No, I am alone," Marissa replied. "Okay, just stay there, I am coming." Marissa began rushing around to get ready to leave, but as she was grabbing her keys, she remembered that John had location sharing enabled on his phone. To make sure she went to the right spot, she checked the tracking app. But when the map loaded, Marissa froze in complete confusion. The blue dot representing John's phone was not at the distant intersection. It was pulsing right inside her own house. She walked down the hallway to John's bedroom and pushed the door open, but his bed was empty. Feeling a deep and growing sense of absolute dread, she decided to call her other son, Kevin, who was also out that night. Kevin answered the phone, sounding very intoxicated. Marissa asked him if John was with him. Kevin laughed and said yes, and then John's voice came over the speaker, sounding much more sober, saying, "Hi, Mom." Marissa asked them about the car accident and the text messages. The boys were completely confused. They explained that there was no accident, and that John had actually lost his phone earlier that night. A chilling realization hit Marissa. If her sons were safe miles away, and John's phone was currently inside her house, it meant a complete stranger was hiding somewhere in her dark home, actively texting her to lure her away. Even worse, she had been talking to her sons on speakerphone right in the middle of her quiet house. Her voice had been echoing through the hallways. The intruder hiding in the dark had heard her entire conversation and knew she had just discovered the truth. Marissa did not waste any time. She quietly slipped out of the front door, ran to her car, locked the doors, and drove a safe distance down the block before calling the police to report a break-in. When the police arrived and searched the house, the intruder was gone. The officers discovered that an office window had been forced open. It was easily liftable and large enough for a person to fit through. The intruder must have heard Marissa's realization and escaped through the window right before she fled. John's phone location updated one last time down the block before going completely dark. The family never found out who was behind the break-in, but it served as a terrifying lesson about the absolute importance of keeping a passcode on your phone to prevent strangers from gaining complete access to your personal life. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. Until next time, see ya. Imagine you are driving down a completely deserted highway, miles away from civilization, with the wind in your hair and nothing but empty desert in front of you. That is exactly where our first story begins. A young man was taking a road trip from Texas to Arizona to visit his brothers. He was driving his old 1991 Ford Mustang. Because he wanted to enjoy the drive, he decided to take a scenic back route. It was one of those roads with just one lane on either side, surrounded by nothing but sand, cacti, and dry shrubs as far as the eye could see. He liked this route because it meant he could drive fast with the top down without having to worry about other cars or police. He was flying down the asphalt at around 90 miles per hour when suddenly he heard some really concerning popping noises coming from under the hood. At the same time, the car started to jolt and jump. He immediately slammed on the brakes, bringing the speeding Mustang to a gradual halt on the side of the dusty road. He got out of the car and popped the hood, pretending like he actually knew what he was looking for. There was no smoke, but he really did not have a clue what the problem could be. He got back behind the wheel and tried to start the engine, but his worst fear came true. The car was completely dead. To make matters worse, when he pulled out his phone to call his roadside service company, he realized he had absolutely no signal. He was completely stranded in the blazing desert heat. He sat on the trunk of his car for literally hours, watching the empty road and sweating. He had not seen a single other car pass by the entire time. Finally, far off in the horizon, he saw a metallic glint reflecting the harsh sunlight. A car was heading his way. He jumped off his trunk, ran toward the middle of the road, and began waving his arms frantically. But as the car got closer, it did not slow down. It just zoomed right past him, leaving him in a cloud of dust. He could not believe someone could just leave another human being stranded like that. Eventually, the sun began to set, and the desert grew incredibly dark and cold. The young man was getting hungry, so he tried to fill his stomach by drinking the emergency water bottles he kept in his trunk. He had almost given up hope when he suddenly saw a pair of headlights approaching in the distance. He had turned his hazard lights on, but he still ran out and waved his arms to make sure he was seen. To his absolute relief, a large pickup truck pulled over to the side of the road. A fairly big man stepped out of the driver's side. The young man walked over and explained that his Mustang had broken down, asking if the man knew anything about cars. But the driver did not seem interested in looking at the engine. Instead, he just stared at the young man and started asking some really uncomfortable questions. He asked if he was out here all alone, where he was heading, and if anyone actually knew where he was right now. The young man felt a cold chill run down his spine, but he tried to play it cool. Finally, the man offered him a ride, saying it would be a long time before they reached an area with phone service. Even though the man made him feel highly uneasy, the young man felt he had no other choice. He climbed up into the passenger seat of the pickup truck, and they drove off into the pitch-black night. As they drove down the empty highway, the driver kept asking more probing questions, wondering why anyone would choose to take such a remote back road. But after just a few minutes of driving, the truck suddenly began to slow down. The driver muttered an angry curse under his breath, pulled onto the sandy shoulder of the road, and looked over. He told the young man that his piece of crap truck had just broken down too. The young man could not believe his luck, but when he looked at the driver, he noticed something incredibly off. The man was not looking at the dashboard or the steering wheel. He was just staring directly at him. A tense 5 seconds passed in complete silence as the man just stared. Finally, the driver asked the young man to step outside and lift the hood of the truck while he stayed inside to crank the latch. By this point, the young man was extremely suspicious. The situation felt like a trap. He got out of the truck and walked to the front, but he made sure to keep a safe distance between himself and the bumper. He stood there in the dark, waiting to hear the click of the hood unlatching. In his mind, a terrifying thought crossed his mind. He pictured the man running him over, and that is exactly what the driver tried to do. Just as the young man took a cautious step toward the truck, the silence of the night was shattered by the sudden deafening roar of the engine. The driver had slammed his foot on the gas. If the young man had not been on high alert, he would have been crushed instantly. But his survival instincts kicked in. He leaped to the side, diving out of the way just a split second, before the heavy truck surged forward over the exact spot where he had been standing. He hit the dirt, scrambled to his feet, and began running as fast as he could into the pitch-black desert. He looked back over his shoulder and saw the red glow of the truck taillights. Suddenly, the darkness was punctuated by loud cracks. Gunshots. The man was actually shooting at him. In the pitch black, it was nearly impossible for the driver to hit a moving target without a massive amount of luck. But the young man felt like he was going to die at any moment. He ran as far into the darkness as his legs could carry him, and then he dove to the ground, keeping himself as flat and low as possible. He lay there, holding his breath, listening to the desert silence. After what felt like an eternity, he heard the truck engine rev and speed off into the distance. He watched the red taillights slowly fade away down the empty road. He spent the rest of the night shivering in the dirt, terrified that the man would return. It was not until the early morning that he woke up and managed to wave down another passing pickup truck. This driver and his wife were normal, kind people. They gave him water, drove him to the nearest town, and helped him get in touch with a towing company. It took a long time to get his car back, but he survived an encounter with a monster. The second story takes place in the woods behind a young girl's house. She was 13 years old and loved to walk to a small circular clearing by a calm stream. In the center of the clearing sat a large rock where she would sit and read. She was a bit of a loner, so this quiet place was her sanctuary. One late afternoon, she walked out to her rock, opened her novel, and began to read. As the woods grew darker in the twilight, she heard the distinct sound of footsteps nearby. Thinking it might be a deer or a wild bear, she quietly followed the rustling sounds, but eventually lost them in the dense trees. When she returned to her clearing, her heart dropped. A strange man was sitting on her rock holding her book. Without turning around, he said out loud that he did not like the book. Then he turned around, smiled creepily, and told her that he watched her come here a lot. Terrified, she immediately ran all the way back to her house, her heart pounding. That night, she was suddenly woken up by a distinct knocking on her bedroom window. She screamed for her dad, who rushed in and then went outside with a flashlight to check. When he came back inside, he looked deeply disturbed. In his hand, he was holding her book. He had found it sitting right outside her bedroom window. The man had followed her home through the dark, figured out which window belonged to her room, and left the book there as a terrifying message. She slept in her parents' room for a week and never went back to those woods. Our next story comes from a person who took a job working for a company based in the mountains. As part of their contract, they were offered a small cottage to stay in while working there. It was an old home built directly into the side of a steep mountain, completely surrounded by a dense and silent forest. The worker lived in the basement, which had been converted into a small living space with a kitchen, a bathroom, and a bed. Off to the side was an L-shaped laundry room that had a heavy wooden door leading directly out to the forest behind the house. This door was locked from the inside and was extremely stiff and difficult to open. Because of this, the worker never used it and always kept it locked. The rest of the cottage was completely empty. One night, after a long day of work, the worker was lying in bed reading and playing solitaire. They turned off the bedside lamp and were just about to fall asleep when they heard a distinct wood creaking noise. They dismissed it at first, but then it repeated. They got out of bed to check the kitchen and closet, but everything was secure. Finally, they opened the door to the laundry room and were immediately hit by a cold gust of night air. They slowly turned the corner of the L shape and saw the heavy forest door wide open, swaying in the breeze. Since it was locked from the inside, there was no way it could have opened on its own. Someone had been waiting in the dark laundry room for them to fall asleep before sneaking out, or they were still hiding just outside in the trees. Our final story takes place in the beautiful but treacherous wilderness of Tennessee. A college student who loved hiking spent a lot of time exploring the many trails branching off the main roads. There was one particularly beautiful spot they loved to visit, featuring a stunning spring waterfall that spilled over a massive granite wall. On this particular trip, the hiker went out with a close friend named Ashley. But on their way back, the unthinkable happened. They somehow got separated. Both of them were highly experienced hikers, so getting separated seemed absolutely impossible. The hiker realized it must have occurred at the ledge system near the top of the waterfall, which branched into 3 different rocky paths. The left path was beautiful, but the hiker stopped using it because there were massive stains in the middle of the rock that looked exactly like dried blood. It looked as if someone had been brutally bludgeoned to death there. The hiker was about 45 seconds ahead of Ashley and took the right path. Realizing he should warn her to avoid the bloody left path, he tried to call out to her, but because of the steep terrain, he could not go backward. He hurried through the rocky corridor and yelled down to the middle path, but there was no reply. He realized she must have taken the left path. Panicking, he ran into the left corridor, expecting to find her freaked out by the bloodstains. But when he got there, she was gone. He called her name repeatedly, but the forest was dead silent. There were no birds singing, no wind blowing, just the quiet sound of running water. He rushed to the top of the falls, hoping to get a better view, and to his surprise, Ashley was sitting there waiting for him. She looked pale. She told him that she had taken the left path because a trail guide had directed her to do so, but the hiker knew for a fact there were no trail guides out here. Ashley explained that the man wore a uniform and a visor, and he had tried to lead her down a narrow hidden side passage. She had refused his offer, instead following the bright light to the top. They realized they were in grave danger and decided to head back to the parking lot immediately. To avoid raising suspicion from whoever was watching them, they pretended they were just running back to the car to grab more water. Before leaving, the hiker placed some fish food in a small rock crevice, which was a little ritual he always did. When they finally reached their car, they were horrified by what they found. Sitting right on the hood of their car was the exact fish food the hiker had left hidden in the rock crevice miles back. Even worse, Ashley realized her water bottle was completely gone from her backpack. The fake trail guide had managed to stalk them all the way back to their vehicle, stealing her water bottle right off her pack without either of them noticing. They drove away as fast as they could, fully aware of how close they had come to becoming victims in those deep Tennessee woods. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. Until next time, see ya.